The rain had come and gone in soft passes through the night, leaving the City of London cold and slick under a thin autumn wind. Gas lamps shivered along Mitre Street. The cobbles glistened where the showers had passed. Above the rooftops the air smelled of coal smoke and damp brick, the old breath of warehouses sleeping behind tall, blank walls. Mitre Square sat behind its 3 narrow passages like a held breath, deserted and barely lit, its southwest corner pooled in deep shadow. Around its edges rose the dark fronts of Kearley and Tongue, of Williams and Colour, of 3 empty houses standing close to a shuttered shop. A watchman kept his lamp burning, somewhere inside. Beyond the walls the East End breathed its restless Sunday. And then, somewhere in that hush, a constable's lantern began to swing. His boots tapped along Mitre Street, slow and even. He turned the corner into the square. The light moved across the cobbles. Then it stopped. In the darkest part of that small enclosure, against a quiet wall, a shape lay still. The lantern hand began to tremble, and somewhere across the rooftops a distant bell began, very softly, to strike the hour. Chapter 1. The City at the Edge of the Empire. Good evening and welcome. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world the sound of this voice has found you, the night is yours now, and the world has grown small. Tell us, if you would, in the comments below where in this wide earth you are listening from, and what hour the clock has marked beside your bed. It is always strange and wonderful to know that the same soft words drift across continents on the same long evening, into kitchens in Sydney and bedrooms in Toronto, into long evening cabs in Karachi and quiet cottages along the west of Ireland, all at once, all together, into the gentle hush of a story shared between strangers. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight we go back. We go back to a city that no longer exists in the way that it once did, to a year that still casts its long, slow shadow over the streets of London, and to the quiet end of a woman whose name has been spoken less often than it should have been. Before we begin, if the sound of these long histories has ever carried you into sleep, or comforted you in some sleepless hour, please consider leaving a small mark of welcome upon this video, a like, a soft press of the subscribe button, a gentle comment left beneath. Each of these small kindnesses helps this little channel grow against the great dark of the wider world, and we are grateful for every one of them. We have always been grateful. And now, settle in. Pull the blankets a little higher. Let the room grow still. We are going back to the autumn of the year 1888, and to a city that was, in many ways, the strangest place on the whole of the earth. The city we are about to walk through was, at that hour, the largest in the world. It had no equal anywhere. By the close of 1888, more than 5 million souls were said to live within its bounds, though the truth was that no man fully knew the count, for the streets stretched far beyond what any map could hold, and the houses had grown over the old fields like ivy over a forgotten gate. Carriages and hansom cabs moved through its long arteries from before dawn until long after midnight. Smoke curled from 100,000 chimneys at every hour of the day, and the air, even in the small hours of morning, held within it the faint, sweet, bitter smell of coal. This was the heart of an empire that reached so far across the world that the sun, by old proud habit, was said never to set upon it. Its ships sailed from London docks to Calcutta, from St. Catherine docks out to Sydney, from the great basins along the Thames to Cape Town and Hong Kong and Halifax, and they returned with tea and cotton and silk and grain and gold, with sugar from the Caribbean and timber from Canada, and wool from the long pastures of Australia. The whole of this trade flowed up the Thames, as if the river itself were a single long vein, and at the centre of all of it lay the small, dense, ancient core that the old maps had always called the City of London. Not Westminster, not Whitehall, not the great suburbs that had crept outward over the green fields for half a century, but the small square mile of stone and brick at the very heart of the capital, where Roman walls had once stood, and where the Lord Mayor still rode out each year in his gilded carriage to the cheers of the crowd. It was here that the wealth of the empire was counted. It was here that the banks kept their long ledgers, and the merchants kept their offices, and the great cathedral of St. Paul's looks down upon all of it from its high stone dome, with the pigeons turning in slow circles above the steps, and the clocks striking the quarters out across the rooftops. You could walk through the city on a weekday morning, and feel the very rhythm of money moving beneath the cobbles. The hansoms would clatter along Cornhill and Cheapside. The clerks would hurry up the steps of the Bank of England with its blind walls of pale Portland stone, and the brokers would gather in the great hall of the Royal Exchange, beneath the painted ceiling and the watchful eyes of carved merchant statues. Telegraph wires ran along the rooftops carrying news of cotton prices to Liverpool, news of gold to Johannesburg, news of war to Bombay. Steamships waited downriver for orders that might come within the hour. The whole of London, on a weekday morning in the autumn of 1888, felt like a vast, slow clockwork engine, ticking quietly toward profit, and toward the long imperial evening that lay ahead. And yet, if you had walked east from St. Paul's, past the small streets of Cheapside, along the long stone face of Leadenhall and out beyond the corner of Aldgate, you would have reached, within 15 minutes of slow walking, a kind of unseen wall behind which the world changed entirely. That wall was not a real wall, not in the sense of stone or mortar, but it was felt by every soul who lived on either side of it. On the western side stood the gold of the city, the offices and the counting houses, the polished doors and the brass plates, and the gentlemen in tall hats and dark coats stepping carefully around the puddles. On the eastern side, in a tangle of courts and alleys and crooked old houses that had been there since the days of the Tudor kings, lay Whitechapel and Spitalfields, and Mile End and Bethnal Green. And here the air was different. The light was different. The very smell of the streets was different. In Whitechapel, in 1888, more than 75,000 souls lived crammed into the kind of housing that no man in Mayfair would have stabled his horses in. The tenements rose 4 and 5 stories high, with their windows broken, their staircases dark, and their walls bowed inward from the weight of too many lives pressed inside. Whole families lived in single rooms. Whole families slept on single mattresses, or on the bare floor where the mattresses had been pawned for the price of a loaf of bread and a small measure of wheat tea. The doors stood always half open onto the courts because there was no air to be had within, and the children played barefoot in the gutters even when the cold of October had begun to settle on the cobbles. The streets of the East End had their own particular trades and their own particular sounds. The match girls of Bow walked home each evening with their hands raw from the white phosphorus and their cheeks already showing the soft hollow of what the chemists called phossy jaw. The dockmen waited each dawn at the gates of the great basins, hoping to be picked for a half-day's labour by the foremen who walked among them with their slow, appraising eyes. The Jewish tailors of Hanbury Street and Brick Lane bent over their machines from before sunrise to long past dark, sewing the cheap coats and trousers that would be sold next month in the great shops of the West End. The costermongers shouted from their barrows along the Whitechapel Road. The watercress girls cried their small bunches at the corners. The drinking houses opened at 6 in the morning and did not close until midnight, and from inside them came the long low murmur of voices and the soft clink of pewter pots upon dark old wood. And running through all of it, like a slow grey river settling over the rooftops, was the long fog of the London winter, already gathering, already drifting in for its long stay. The coal fires of 5 million households poured their smoke into the air each evening, and the smoke mixed with the damp that rose from the Thames, and what came down upon the city was a low, heavy, yellow-grey mist that the people of London simply called the fog, though it was thicker than any natural cloud, and it carried within it the taste of soot and the smell of the gas lamps and the breath of the river itself. On the worst nights, a man could not see his own hand at the end of his arm. On the worst nights, the gas lamps burned at noon, and the omnibuses moved at a walking pace, with their drivers leaning forward into the murk, and the lamp-lighters going from post to post with their long brass poles long before the proper hour of evening had arrived. This was the texture of late Victorian London. Gas lamps, la horrors, house, curt throwing their soft yellow pools onto the wet cobbles. The clop of horses' hooves muffled by the damp. The slow chuff of the steam trains running beneath the streets along the new underground lines that had been creeping outward for 20 years and more. The cry of the cabmen at the corners. The bells of 100 churches, each one keeping its own time, ringing the quarters out over the rooftops in a long, slow-layered conversation that began at 6 in the morning and did not end until the small hours had taken almost everything to sleep. The smell of frying fish from the shops along the Mile End Road. The smell of stale beer from the doorways of the public houses. The smell of horses and hay from the great mews behind the better streets. The thin, sweet smoke of pipes drifting out from the public bars. The hiss of kettles in 1,000 small back kitchens. And at the eastern edge of the city, where the Welf ended and the East End began, There was a particular small seam, a quiet line of streets where the two worlds touched without quite meeting. It ran along Aldgate and Houndsditch and Bishopsgate. It carried within it warehouses and lodging houses, taverns and small shops, the offices of the city merchants on one side and the bedchambers of the East End poor on the other, separated sometimes by no more than a single brick wall. The constables of two different police forces walked their beats on either side of that seam, the city men in their slightly heavier uniforms with their numbered collars, and the metropolitan men in their lighter blue, each keeping to his own side of the small invisible line that ran through the cobbles. The two forces did not always speak to one another. They did not always share what they knew. And along this seam, between two cities pressed against each other, the dark of the autumn settled in upon the wet stones. But not on this evening. Not yet. On this evening, the year 1888 is still settling into its long autumn. The summer rains have given way to a long, cold, wet September. The lamps are being lit a little earlier each evening. The hop pickers are returning home from the orchards of Kent, with their hands stained from the hops and their pockets nearly empty. The omnibuses are full of clerks going home to their warm parlours, and the small back kitchens of Whitechapel are slowly filling with the smell of boiled potatoes and weak tea. The newspapers along the Strand are crying out the day's headlines. The Times is full of long columns about Ireland and Germany, and the small wars at the edges of empire. The Pall Mall Gazette is asking, in its long sober prose, what is to be done about the East End. The Star is selling its penny editions on every corner of the city, and somewhere, in a small back kitchen at a lodging-house on Flower and Dean Street, a woman called Catherine Eddowes is sitting beside a man called John Kelly, drinking tea from a tin cup. She is sitting in the warm kitchen with the rain hissing softly against the small window, and she is laughing quietly at something John has said. The fire in the small range glows low. The other lodgers come and go around her, carrying their bowls, their kettles, their small bundled belongings. The deputy at the door takes coppers from the new arrivals and hands them their tickets for the night. The smell of cabbage and salt fish and pipe smoke hangs in the air. Outside the kitchen window, a hansom passes slowly along the wet cobbles, its lamps swinging soft yellow against the brick. A few doors down, a watchman closes his small wooden door against the rain. The bells of Christchurch, Spitalfields ring the half-hour, and the sound carries across the rooftops and into the small back kitchen of the lodging-house, where Catherine sets down her tin cup and pulls her shawl a little closer about her shoulders. The deputy speaks softly to one of the new arrivals at the door. The fire in the small range crackles once, and then is quiet. The rain comes down a little harder, then softer, then steady again upon the cobbles. The city goes on around her. The gaslight burns. The fog lowers. The wide, wealthy heart of the empire goes about its long evening work, with its bankers and its dockmen and its policemen and its lamplighters, and the long unseen wall between the city and the East End stands quiet and dark in the rain. The clocks of the churches strike 8. The clocks of the churches strike 9. The year 1888 settles slowly down into the long autumn night, and the City of London breathes once, and twice and again, beneath the long heavy weight of its own great age. And the rain comes down upon the cobbles, soft and slow and steady, as it has come down upon them for 100 years past, soft and patient and quiet. And the gas lamps burn on into the dark. Chapter 2. An Autumn of Rain and Rumour. The summer of 1888 was the wettest in living memory across the whole of England. It had begun cold in May, with hailstorms in the south and frost in the long fields of the north, and it had never quite warmed. The newspapers had complained of it almost daily through June and July. The fruit had failed in the orchards of Kent. The hops had come in late and thin upon the vines. The cricket grounds at Lord's and the Oval had stood empty beneath the long grey rain. The bank holidays had passed in cold drizzle, and the seaside towns along the south coast had reported their worst takings for a decade past. The clerks of London, walking to their offices each morning beneath their black umbrellas, had begun to joke, in their dry, weary way, that the long English summer of legend was being washed clean off the face of the earth. But where the rain had merely soured the holiday seasons of the wealthier streets, in the East End of London it had settled in with a darker weight. The courts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, narrow and crowded and badly drained at the best of times, had filled with standing pools of dirty water along their cobbled gutters. The walls of the old tenements had grown dark with damp. The yellow gas lamps along the curb had burned a little dimmer through the long river mists that rolled in from the docks each evening, and in the lodging houses that lined Flower and Dean Street and Dorset Street and Thrall Street, the smell of wet wool and unwashed linen had hung in the close air from June through to September, and no small fire of sea coal had ever quite been able to drive it out. Into this long damp summer, in the small hours of the last night in August, the East End had received the first of the killings that would shadow the autumn ahead of it. A carman named Charles Cross, on his way to his early shift along a narrow cobbled lane called Buck's Row on the eastern edge of Whitechapel, had walked past a still bundle lying against the wooden gate of a stable yard. He had thought at first that the bundle was a tarpaulin. He had crossed the road and looked down, and what he had seen had sent him running back along the lane to find another man. The woman lying there was Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years of age, the wife of a printer's machinist from whom she had long parted, and the mother of 5 children, sometimes called Polly by those who knew her in the lodging-houses along Thrall Street. She had been seen alive only a little earlier by a friend at the corner of Whitechapel Road and Brady Street, drunk, and laughing and complaining that she had not yet earned the price of her bed for the night. She had walked away from her friend into the lamplight, and she had not been seen alive again. A little more than a week later, on the dawn of the 8th September, in a narrow backyard behind a house at number 29 Hanbury Street, a porter named John Davis had come down the back stairs at 6 in the morning to find another still figure lying in the cold half-light beside the wooden palings. This one was Annie Chapman, 47 years of age, the widow of a coachman called John Chapman, the mother of 3 children of whom only one yet lived. She had been turned out of her lodging-house in Dorset Street in the early hours for want of the 4pence she could not raise. She had walked out into the dark to try and earn it. She had not come back to claim her bed. 2 women, 2 East End mornings, 2 narrow places in the half-light. And by the second of these mornings, by the dawn of that long wet September, something had quietly changed in the streets of Whitechapel that would not change back again. The newspapers along Fleet Street had taken hold of the killings within hours. The Star, that new halfpenny evening paper which had only been founded that very year, had filled column after column with what its writers called the East End horror. The Pall Mall Gazette, under the long sober pen of its editor, had written of the conditions in the rookeries that had bred such darkness. The Times had printed the official statements of the Metropolitan Police in dry sober paragraphs. The Penny illustrated paper had filled its broadsheets with wood-cut images of the dark alleys where the women had been found, drawn at angles too steep for the streets themselves, with shadows piled in the corners like soft black snow, and in the East End itself the rumours had begun to move from court to court like a slow grey wind. In the public houses along the Whitechapel Road, the dockmen and the porters had bent their heads close over their pewter pots and whispered the names of men they thought might be the killer. The Jewish tailors in their workshops along Hanbury Street and Brick Lane had spoken in low, careful Yiddish about whether one of their own community might be blamed unjustly, for the long, ugly habit of blaming the foreigner had always lain just beneath the surface of London streets, and they had felt its weight pressing against their doors. The match girls of Bow, walking home in their thin shawls through the long evenings, had begun to walk in 2s and 3s where before they had walked alone. The children of the rookeries had taken up a new street game, in which one child played the shadow and the others ran shrieking through the alleys. The watercress girls at the corners of the Whitechapel Road had begun to pack their small baskets away before dark, and the slow-walking constables on their long beats had begun to shine their bull's-eye lanterns into every doorway as they passed. By the middle of September, the people of Whitechapel had begun to feel that the official forces of order were not enough. The constables of the Metropolitan Police, in their long blue sarge coats and their tall reinforced helmets, had been doubled on their beats through the eastern divisions, with men brought in from outer stations to walk the courts at night. But the courts were many. The constables were few, and the killer, whoever he was, seemed to move through the gaslight and the fog without leaving more than the smallest sign of his passing. He had taken his victims in places where men were sleeping at 30 paces, in lodging houses with their kitchens still warm, in backyards with their windows looking down from above. And yet no eye had marked him. And so, on the evening of the 10th of September, in a public house called the Crown on the Mile End Road, 60 men of the East End trading classes had gathered around a long deal table beneath the gaslight, with their hats laid down before them and their pipes held in their hands. The landlord of the Crown, a man called Joseph Aarons, had set out the pewter pots. The chair had been taken by a local builder and churchwarden called George Lusk, a steady man of middle years, with a long grey beard and a slow, careful manner of speech. And by the end of that long evening, around the smoky table in the parlour of the Crown, a thing called the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee had come into being. The committee had been formed in part because business in the East End was failing. The respectable people had begun to keep away from the eastern districts at night, and the markets had grown quiet, and the small shops along the main roads had begun to shut their shutters earlier than they had ever done. But it had been formed also because the men who sat around that long deal table had children of their own, and wives, and daughters, and old mothers, and they had no faith left that the blue uniforms alone would be enough to keep the dark from their doors. They had agreed that night to raise a reward of £50 for any word that led to the killer's capture. They had agreed to hire unemployed men, hand-picked from the lodging-houses, to walk the courts of Whitechapel from midnight until the small hours of the morning. They had agreed that the patrolling men should carry whistles and sticks, and that some at least of them should walk in noiseless boots, the better to come quietly upon any wrongdoer in a darkened lane. By the third week of September, the patrols were walking. Night after night, in the long wet hours after midnight, the unemployed men of George Lusk's committee moved softly through the courts and alleys of Whitechapel, in their noiseless boots and their long coats, with their whistles hanging on cords beneath their lapels. They walked the entrance of Hanbury Street and the back of Bucks Row. They walked Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street and Thrall Street. They walked the dark gap of Mitre Square at the very edge of the city. They walked, and they listened, and they shone their small bull's-eye lanterns into the deeper shadows, and they spoke softly to the women they passed at the corners, and they wished them safely home. And still, even with the patrols, the East End felt afraid. The gas lamps seemed to burn smaller against the long fog. The bells of Christ Church and St. Botolph's seemed to ring more slowly through the wet air. The lodging-house deputies left their lanterns burning longer at the doors. The women who worked the streets, who lived from the half-hour to the half-hour upon a few small coppers, walked more quickly along the curb and stood a little farther back into the lamplight and looked twice at every figure that passed. Then, on the morning of the 27th of September, a letter had arrived at the offices of the Central News Agency in Fleet Street. It had been written in red ink upon a folded sheet in a small, confident hand. It had taunted the police and the public. It had promised more. And it had been signed at the bottom with 3 short words. The press had hesitated for 2 days. The letter had then been printed in the Daily News and reprinted across every other paper in the kingdom. And by the morning of Saturday, the 29th of September, every newspaper boy on every corner from Lambeth to Bow was crying out a name that had not existed 3 days before. The name was Jack the Ripper. The name was on every wall. The name was on every poster. The name was in every kitchen, in every public house, in every lodging-house parlour. The name had passed into the long unwritten archive of folk memory before the ink upon the broadsheets had even dried. The people of Whitechapel had a name now for the shadow that had walked among them through the long summer rain. They did not love the name. They did not lean toward it. They spoke it instead in low, careful voices, as one might speak the name of a fever or a winter cold. And the autumn of 1888 had drawn cold around them, evening by evening, as the lamps had been lit a little earlier each night. It was into this autumn that the woman called Catherine Eddowes had returned from the hot fields of Kent, with her hands stained from the bines and her pockets nearly empty. It was into this autumn that her companion John Kelly had walked beside her along the long road home, with his old coat slung over his shoulder. It was into this autumn that the small back kitchen at Cooney's lodging-house had filled with the smell of weak tea and boiled cabbage, and the slow even breath of 40 sleeping lodgers. It was into this autumn that the gas lamps had burned along the curbs of Flower and Dean Street, and the rain had hissed against the small grimy windows of the back parlour, and the long quiet weight of late September had settled down upon the East End of London like a damp grey blanket, and the city had gone on, around them. The constables of the Metropolitan Police had walked their double beats. The volunteers of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee had crept through the courts in their noiseless boots. The newspapers had printed their woodcuts and their column inches and their fresh dark headlines. The bells of the churches had rung the quarters out across the rooftops. The river fog had drifted in from the docks. The rain had come down upon the cobbles, soft and slow and patient. And the autumn of 1888 had drawn its long damp shawl a little more closely about the shoulders of the East End. The wind had come down soft and steady through the gaslight. The river mist had thickened above the rooftops, and the night went on around its small, unsleeping lamps, with the East End breathing its quiet, uneasy breath beneath the wet cobbles, and the rain falling without ceasing upon the slates and chimneys of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Chapter 3. The Wall Between Two Cities. The boundary between the City of London and the parishes of the East End had no single wall to mark it. It had no gate. It had no banner hanging across its entrance. It was instead a long thin line of streets and corners and old stones that ran north from the river, up to the boundary of Shoreditch, with the high stone face of the old city rising along its western side and the close brick courts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields pressing against its eastern. Along this line ran the names that any old Londoner could speak from memory. Tower Hill at the southern end, where the great medieval fortress still kept its long watch over the Thames. Crutched Friars, where the Order of the Brothers of the Cross had once kept their cloister. Aldgate High Street, where the great iron pump still stood at the corner that the old maps had called Aldgate Pump for 200 years. Houndsditch, where the dogs of the medieval city had once been buried beyond the war in the Roman time. Bishopsgate, where one of the great gates of the medieval city had stood until the late 1700s. And up through Norton Falgate, where the boundary at last gave way to Shoreditch and the open country beyond. Along this thin seam, two cities pressed together. On the western side, every brick belonged to the Corporation of the City of London, with its Lord Mayor, its sheriffs, its aldermen, its livery companies and its ancient charters that had been renewed by every English king since the Confessor. On the eastern side, every brick belonged to the parishes of the Metropolitan Board of Works, with its slums, its sweatshops, its docks, its boroughs, and the long flat sprawl of the East End that stretched outward for miles into the marshes beyond. To walk across the line at Aldgate Pump was to leave one form of England behind, and to enter another within the space of a single step. The first form was old and rich and proud. The second form was old too, but it was poor, and it was crowded, and it was watched by another kind of light. That second kind of light was the lamp of a different police force. The Metropolitan Police had been the older idea, brought into being in the year 1829 by an Act of Parliament under Sir Robert Peel, who had then been Home Secretary in the long Tory ministry of the Duke of Wellington. Their men had been the first uniformed civil police in the long history of the English nation. They had numbered, in their first year of being, a little under 1,000. By the autumn of 1888 they had numbered more than 14,000 men strong. Their long blue lines stretched outward from the centre of London across the whole of the metropolis, north to Highgate and Hampstead, south to Clapham and Battersea, east to Stratford and Walthamstow, west to Hammersmith and Acton. They walked their beats from a great central headquarters at Whitehall Place, beside the small back lane that London had always called Scotland Yard, where the kings of Scotland had once kept their London lodgings in the long centuries before the union of the crowns. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in the autumn of 1888 was a soldier. His name was Sir Charles Warren. He had served the British Empire as an officer of the Royal Engineers from the Cape of Good Hope to the deserts of Sinai. He had surveyed the holy sites of Jerusalem for the Palestine Exploration Fund in the long years before he had returned to England. He had commanded troops in the small wars of the Empire across southern Africa. He had taken up the office of Commissioner in the spring of the year 1886, and he had spent 2 long difficult years trying to bring military order to a civil force, with very mixed results. He was a tall, thin man with a long grey moustache, with the upright bearing of a parade, ground and the slow, patient stare of a man who had once read maps under the desert sun. The journalists of Fleet Street had begun, by the autumn of 1888, to find him a difficult man to like. The City of London Police, by long contrast, had come later, in the year 1839, when the corporation of the city had insisted that its ancient liberties would not be folded into the new metropolitan force. The city had governed itself for 1,000 years. The city would govern itself now. The Act of Parliament had granted them their own commissioner, their own headquarters, their own ranks, their own constables. They had built their headquarters at 26 Old Jewry, a narrow stone building set just behind the eastern wall of the Bank of England. They had numbered, by the autumn of 1888, a little under 1,000 men in all. They had patrolled an area of barely 1 square mile of stone and brick, but that small mile was the very heart of the British Empire. Within it stood the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange, the Mansion House, the Old Bailey, the Inns of Court, and the great Wren Cathedral of St. Paul's. Within it stood the offices of every great merchant house, every great insurance company, every great trading firm of London. Within it, the wealth of the empire was counted each working day from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and within it slept perhaps 20,000 resident souls when the day's long work was done in the small remaining tenements that the city had not yet swept away. The city police walked their beats among these stones with a particular care. Their numbers were small. Their pride was great. Their men knew the names of every doorman at every counting-house, and they knew the regular footsteps of every watchman in every warehouse, and they spoke softly to the night cleaners, who came in at the small hours to scrub the wide marble halls. The Commissioner of the City of London Police in the year 1888 was a long-serving officer named Sir James Fraser, but in the late days of September of that year, Sir James was away on his annual leave. The acting head of the force, for those few weeks, was a man named Major Henry Smith. He was an energetic officer of the Crimean generation, who had once served in the Royal Artillery against the Russian guns at Sebastopol. He kept a small flat near his office at Old Jurey. He had the long habit of riding out at night through the city streets in plain clothes, watching his own constables on their beats, testing them quietly, learning the streets by his own slow, careful feet. By the autumn of 1888, Major Smith had begun to take the killings of the eastern parishes very personally indeed, though they were not, in the strict reading of the law, within his jurisdiction at all. The two forces were uniformed in different blue. The city men wore a slightly heavier cloth, with red collars and the small badge of the corporation on their reinforced helmets. The metropolitan men wore a lighter blue, with their long numbered collars and their tall reinforced helmets that had only been brought in the year before. The city men were paid a little better than their metropolitan counterparts, and the city men knew it. The city men patrolled their beats in pairs along the busier streets, and alone along the quieter ones. The metropolitan men walked, almost without exception, alone. The two forces did not, as a matter of course, share what they knew. They reported to different commissioners. They served different magistrates. They patrolled different streets, and they kept different files in different headquarters, and they spoke different small languages of policing. The city men with their formal corporation pride, the metropolitan men with their long official line that ran upward through the Home Office to the Secretary of State for the Home Department in Whitehall. When a man committed a crime on one side of Aldgate High Street and ran across to the other, the constable of the first side could not pursue him into the second without trouble, and the constable of the second side could not be relied upon to know who he was at all. This is what the boundary looked like upon the ground. If you had stood at the corner of Mitre Street and Aldgate High Street on a grey afternoon in late September of 1888, you could have seen the two forces with a single turn of your head. To your left, walking westward up Aldgate, came the city man in his heavier blue, his red collar braid catching the wet light, his hands behind his back, his eyes moving slowly along the curb. To your right, walking eastward into Whitechapel along the same high street, came the metropolitan man in his lighter blue, his number gleaming on his collar, his slow, steady tread sounding upon the cobbles. They might pass each other within 10 paces of the corner. They might lift a hand in slow acknowledgment as they crossed. They might not. They walked their separate beats. They returned to their separate stations. They wrote up their separate notes in the separate hands of separate sergeants, and they slept in separate beds in separate streets, and the long thin seam of stone and gaslight between them ran on through the night without ever being closed. And it was upon this seam that one particular small enclosure lay, hidden behind its 3 narrow stone passages, with its tall blank warehouses and its single resident family and its old empty houses leaning together in the dark. The square was called Mitre Square. It belonged by a thin margin of yards to the City of London. The street that ran along its southern edge was Mitre Street, which had been called Mitre Court in the older maps. The covered passage that ran into its northeast corner was Church Passage, named for the long-gone church of St. James of the Cloisters that had once stood near it. The lane that ran into its northwest corner was a small turning through Church Place, leading out toward Houndsditch. The whole square measured no more than 77 feet on its longer side and barely 80 feet across. In the eyes of the corporation of the City of London, Mitre Square was a perfectly ordinary small commercial yard, of the kind that the city had inherited from the old medieval orders of monks and friars who had once owned half of Aldgate. It had been built upon the cloister of an ancient priory called Holy Trinity, which had been founded by Queen Matilda, the wife of Henry I, in the year 1108. and had been dissolved under Henry VIII in the long unbuilding of the monastic houses in the 1530s. The stones of the priory had long since gone. Warehouses had replaced them. A man called Taylor kept a small shop at the corner of Mitre Street, with 3 empty houses ranged beside him. A firm called Kearley and Tongue kept its long bonded warehouses along the eastern side of the square. A second warehouse kept by a firm called Williams and Cooney stood opposite. A single small house, number 3 Mitre Square, was lived in by a constable of the city police named Pierce, with his wife and his children. And in the southwest corner of the square, where the warehouses fell into deep shadow, there stood the longest stretch of empty wall. In the eyes of the constables of the Metropolitan Force, that same Mitre Square was a place a few yards beyond their reach. They could walk to the corner of Mitre Street and look in. They could not enter. They could not patrol. They could only nod to the city man who passed there at the quarter hour and turn back into the long warren of Whitechapel that began just one short cobblestone east of where they stood. The seam between the two cities ran straight through that small enclosure, with the gaslight of one force on one side and the gaslight of another force on the other. Above the square, the autumn rain came down upon the slates of the warehouses, soft and slow and constant. The gas lamps hissed quietly along Mitre Street. The single small window of Police Constable Persaise's house glowed faintly behind its drawn curtain. The night watchman of Kearley and Tongue sat at his small wooden desk inside the warehouse, with his lamp burning low beside him. The bells at St. Botolph's at Aldgate rang the quarters out across the rooftops, and the long thin seam between two cities lay still beneath its damp grey shawl. Neither one thing nor the other, neither city nor East End, with its narrow stone passages drinking in the dark. The rain came down upon the cobbles. The watchman turned a page of his ledger. The city man and the metropolitan man passed one another at the corner of Mitre Street and Aldgate High Street, slow and even and silent, with no word spoken between them, and then they were each one alone again, walking their separate beats into the long quiet of the September night. Utchapit. Chapter 4. The daughter of Wolverhampton long before the streets of Whitechapel, and long before the small dark passages of Aldgate, Catherine Eddowes had begun her life in a small terraced house in the smoky heart of the Black Country. The Black Country lay west of the great industrial town of Birmingham, in the broad, green and grey middle of England, where the coal seams of the South Staffordshire field had been broken open by mine shafts and by iron furnaces and by tinplate mills for more than 100 years. Its name had not been given in jest. The air above its towns and villages had been blackened by the soot of 1,000 chimneys, day and night, year after year. The grass in the small fields between the works had turned grey by the end of any long summer. The rivers had run heavy with mill dust. The skies above Wolverhampton and Bilston and Walsall and Wednesbury had glowed orange through the night from the long mouths of the furnaces, where the molten iron and the hot tin were poured and rolled and pressed by men whose hands had been burned by the trade until they could scarcely close at the end of a long shift. The whistles of the trains on the New London and North Western Railway sounded out across the rooftops at every hour of the day. The chapel bells rang the quarters above the smoke. The cobbles ran with rainwater and with the grey slurry of the mill yards. It was into this country that Catherine Eddowes was born, on the 14th day of April in the year 1842, in a small terraced street in the parish of Wolverhampton called Graiseley Green, at a house at number 20 Merridale Street. The day of her birth was a Thursday. The weather, in the small Midland weather records of the time, had been cold and showery, with a soft east wind. The chapel bells of the town had rung a steady afternoon round. The forges had burned. The trains had whistled past the brick viaducts that ran along the southern edge of the town, and in a small narrow bedroom in Merridale Street, the wife of a tinplate worker had brought her sixth child into the world by the light of a candle. Her father was a man named George Eddowes. He was a tinplate worker by trade, as his father had been before him, and his father's father before him, in the long Welsh-rooted family that had walked east from the valleys of Monmouthshire 2 generations earlier in search of work. The Eddowes family had come, originally, from the small town of Pontypool in the South Wales coalfield. They had walked across the border into England in the great industrial moving of the early 1800s, when the iron towns of the Black Country had drawn workers from every quiet valley in the kingdom. George Eddowes had been baptised in Bilston, just north of Wolverhampton, in the year 1808. He was a tall, dark-eyed, hard-handed man, with the slow, careful manner of a craftsman who had served his apprenticeship under his own father. He was 34 years of age in the spring of 1842, and he had been married to his wife for 10 of those years. His wife was a small, dark-haired woman called Catherine Eddowes, who had been working as a cook at a place called the Peacock Hotel in the years before her marriage. They had married in 1832. They had a long brood of children. By the day of the small, dark-haired daughter's birth, they already had 5 older children at home, named Alfred and Harriet and Emma and Eliza and Elizabeth. 6 more would follow over the long years to come. 12 children in all, of whom only 10 would live past their earliest years. It was a great family, even by the standards of the working houses of the Black Country, where 6 and 7 children to a single bedroom had been no uncommon thing. The trade by which George Eddowes earned his weekly wage was an old one, and a hot one, and a hard one. The tinplate workers of Wolverhampton stood at long benches beside the rolling mills and the dipping tanks. They took the long flat sheets of iron from the furnaces, and they pressed them, and they stamped them, and they cleaned them in the long acid baths, and at last they dipped them into the tanks of molten tin to coat them with their bright, thin silver. The finished sheets were sold to the great merchants of Wolverhampton for the manufacture of pots and pans and lanterns, of toys and tea caddies and small painted trays, of biscuit tins and eel cans and 1,000 other small bright objects that found their way into every kitchen of the kingdom. The tin men of Wolverhampton were among the most skilled metalworkers in the whole of England. They were also among the most poorly paid. Sometime in the early years of his daughter Catherine's childhood, after one of the long bitter strikes that had broken out among the tin men of the town, George Eddowes had gathered up his family and walked south. He had gathered up his children, with his wife at his side, and his brother William and his brother's family beside him, and he had begun to walk. They had walked east out of Wolverhampton along the Great Holyhead Road that the engineer Thomas Telford had built 30 years before. They had walked through Birmingham. They had walked through Coventry and Northampton and St Albans. They had walked across the long flat fields of Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. They had walked by stages for perhaps a fortnight in all. The children had ridden in turn upon a borrowed cart. The mother had carried the smallest in her arms. And at the end of those long days of walking they had come down at last from the high northern road into the small grey streets of the great city of London, and they had found their way south of the river to the parish of Bermondsey. Bermondsey, in the late 1840s, was a working district of London south of the Thames, where the leather tanneries lined the streets along the river, and the small warehouses of Tooley Street ran beneath the long arches of the new railway. The smell of the leather pits hung in the close air. The smell of the river hung beneath it. The Eddowes family had settled at a house at 4 Barden Place in the narrow streets behind the old High Street, and later they had moved to a slightly larger house at 35 West Street. George Eddowes had found work in a place called Bell Court within the City of London itself, where he had taken employment as a japanner, a finisher of small painted tin goods, applying the dark hard lacquer that gave the goods their long shine. His brother William had soon turned back toward Wolverhampton with his own family, unable to settle in the great smoky capital. George had stayed. He had stayed for the rest of his life. The children of George Eddowes had grown up in Bermondsey through the long middle of the 1850s. The young Catherine, sometimes called Set by her family, in the half-Welsh, half-Cockney habit of the Eddowes children, had been sent to a charity school nearby, at a small old church on Tooley Street that had been called St John's. The school had been built for the children of the poor of the parish. It had a single low schoolroom, with rows of long pine benches and a small slate hung at the front. The schoolmistress, a tired but kindly woman of middle age, had taught the children to read from the Bible and to write upon their slates and to sing the long, slow hymns of the English liturgy. The children had sat in their rough, thin clothes, and they had learned their letters, and they had walked home through the leather-smelling streets of Bermondsey in the long evenings. Catherine had been a quick child. Her relatives had remembered her in later years as a clever girl, with dark, wavy auburn hair and hazel eyes, and a sharp, small voice that liked to sing. But the long life of the Eddowes family in Bermondsey had begun to break down before its eldest children had even left the house. In the late autumn of the year 1855, when the young Catherine was 13 years of age, her mother had taken ill with a slow wasting cough that the doctors of the parish had called consumption. The mother had lain in the small upstairs bedroom of the Bermondsey house for several long weeks. She had grown thinner and thinner, and on the 17th day of November in that year, with her family gathered around her, she had died. She had been 42 years old. Her young daughter Catherine, who had borne her mother's name, had been 13. The young Catherine's father had not long survived her. He had drifted through his work and through the small streets of Bermondsey in the long winter that followed, with the long heart of his marriage gone out of him. By the spring of the year 1857 he too had passed away, leaving behind a great clutch of children with no parents and almost no means. The records of his death have not survived in any catalogue that we possess. We know only that he was gone before the May of that year, and that his children, in the months that followed, were taken one by one into the small brick walls of the Bermondsey Union workhouse. The young Catherine, 15 years of age with the long shadow of two parents' deaths behind her, was one of those who entered the workhouse for a time. The Bermondsey Union workhouse stood in a large brick complex on Tanner Street, where the older paupers were kept in long wards beneath barred windows, and the younger ones were sent to the schoolroom each morning for instruction in reading and in needlework and in the small useful trades by which a child of the parish might one day earn its keep. Catherine did not stay there long. Her relatives in Wolverhampton, hearing of the family's collapse, had sent word that they would take her in. They had room for her at the small house of her aunt on Goulston Street. She had travelled north by the long, slow stages of the railway, and she had come at last to the small back street of her aunt's house at Goulston Street in Wolverhampton, in the same town where she had been born. There she had been put to work at the very tinplate trade that her father had walked away from a decade before. She had taken her place at the old Hall Works, a great tinplate factory at the centre of the town, where she had been employed as a tinplate stamper. A tinplate stamper stood at a long press through the working day, pressing the patterned dies into the thin sheets of tin that were rolled past her by the foreman. The pay was poor. The work was hard. Her hands had grown calloused, and her fingers had grown stained with the dark grey of the metal, and her back had grown weary by the end of every long working shift. For several years she had walked back and forth between her aunt's house in Wolverhampton and the lodgings of an uncle in Birmingham, a shoemaker called Thomas Eddowes, who kept a small house in a street called Baggot Street. She had worked during her Birmingham months as a tray polisher at a firm in Legg Street, where the polished Japan trays of the kind that her father had finished in London were made for export across the long shipping routes of the Empire. She had grown into a young woman of small stature, of perhaps 5 feet exactly, slim, dark-haired, with hazel eyes and a quick laugh and a sharp tongue. She had begun to keep her own company. She had begun to wander between the public houses of Wolverhampton and Birmingham in the long Saturday evenings, in the company of the other young women of her trade. And it was in those long evenings, somewhere around the year 1861 or 1862, when the young Catherine Eddowes was perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, that she had met for the first time a tall ex-soldier called Thomas Conway, with a long campaign moustache and the slow, careful manner of a man who had served his country in the late wars of empire. He had recently come home from his service. He had begun to earn a small living by writing and selling gallows ballads at the fairs of the Midlands. He had carried with him a deep, quiet sadness that women of that town and that generation had learned to recognise in the soldiers who had come back from the long heat of India and the cold winters of the Crimea. She had liked him. She had liked the sound of his voice. She had liked the way he held himself in the lamplight of the public houses. And by the end of that year, the young Catherine Eddowes had quietly packed her small bundle of belongings, and she had left her aunt's house in Wolverhampton, and she had taken to the road with the soldier called Thomas Conway. They had walked out together into the long fairs of the English countryside, with their printed ballads in a small leather case, and their lives spread out before them upon the open road. Behind her, the chimneys of the Black Country had gone on smoking into the long evening sky. The trains of the London and North Western Railway had gone on whistling past the brick viaducts at the southern edge of Wolverhampton. The slow wet bells of the town had gone on ringing the quarters out across the soot-darkened slates. The old Hall Works had gone on stamping its bright thin sheets through the long working day, and the small terraced house at Meredale Street, where she had been born, had stood quiet in the rain of another Midland evening, with the lamps not yet lit, and the gutters running soft beneath the eaves. Chapter 5. The Years with Thomas Conway. The fairs of the English Midlands had been moving across the country since long before the steam engines came. They had drawn their crowds in market squares and on village greens from the first long summers of the Plantagenet kings, with their tinkers and their hawkers and their broadside sellers, with their puppet booths and their painted boards, with their ballads sung above the wooden crates. They had moved by slow degrees from town to town, gathering their tents and their wagons and their painted canvases, and pulling them away by horse and donkey at the close of each day, and they had carried the small news of England with them as they went. The births and the deaths, the riots and the public hangings, the new love songs and the old comic tales, all of these things printed on penny ballads and sold for a copper at every stop. They had gathered at Birmingham and at Wolverhampton and at Bilston and at Walls, in the market squares of every town in the long industrial heart of England. And they had drawn the working people of those towns out from their forges and their mills and their long working benches into the open air for a single Saturday evening of song and small bright laughter. It was upon this slow long circuit of the country fairs that Catherine Eddowes and the man called Thomas Conway had taken up their lives together, somewhere around the year 1862, when she was a young woman of 19 years and he was about 24. Thomas Conway was not, in the truest sense of the records, the man called Thomas Conway. His given name had been Thomas Quin, and he had been born in a small village called Kilgover in the parish of Louisburgh in the western county of Mayo in Ireland, around the year 1837. He was Irish through and through. He had grown up in the long quiet years that followed the great hunger of the 1840s, when half of the population of his county had died of starvation or had fled the land for the New World across the Western Sea. He had joined the British Army in October of the year 1857, when he was 20 years of age, taking the King's shilling at a recruiting post and signing on with the 1st Battalion of the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of Foot. He had been given the private's number 350. He had served his time in Bombay and Madras on the long hot edges of the Empire for 2 years and 82 days. He had earned a single good conduct badge. He had grown ill in the long Indian heat, with one of those slow-wasting fevers that the army doctors of that century had no real means of treating. He had been discharged on the grounds of poor health in the October of the year 1861. He had returned to England with a small army pension drawn in his given name of Quin, and he had begun to make his way through the country fairs of the Midlands, selling penny ballads to pay his keep. By the time he had met the young Catherine Eddowes, he had taken to himself the name Conway. No one ever set down clearly why he had chosen that name. He was a tall, thin man with a long campaign moustache and the slow, careful manner of a man who had served in the long heat. He carried a small leather case of printed sheets and a quill, and a small bottle of black ink. He sold his ballads at the corners of the market squares of Birmingham and Wolverhampton and Stourbridge and Bilston, and he wrote new ones in the evenings at the gaslit tables of the public houses, and he kept his pension money quiet, drawn only when he could find his way to a paymaster's office in his old regimental name. He was not a drinker. He was not, in the ordinary way, a loud man. He had brought back with him from the army a long, quiet sadness of the kind that the soldiers of that generation had often carried, and he kept it folded down beneath his coat like a small folded handkerchief. Catherine had liked him from the first. She had liked the soft Irish lilt of his voice, with its old western edges. She had liked the way he could make a small tune on a borrowed fiddle. She had liked the way he wrote his ballads in a quick small hand, leaning over the public-house table with the steam of his pipe rising about his head. She had walked out with him into the long open road, away from the small house of her aunt on Goulston Street in Wolverhampton, with the small bundle of her own belongings, and the bright, sharp confidence of a young woman of 19 who had decided that the world was wider than the tin works of the Black Country. She had stitched a small blue tattoo upon her left forearm, in the way of working women of that generation, 2 small letters in the soft blue ink of a Birmingham parlour artist. The letters were T and C, for the man whom she had taken to herself in the manner of common law. Their first child was a daughter. She had been born in the workhouse at Yarmouth, in the long flat county of Norfolk, on the 18th of April in the year 1863. Catherine had given the baby her own first name, with the small adding of a second in honour of the child's grandmother on her father's side. The girl was called Catherine Anne, but from the very first her parents and her relatives had spoken of her simply as Annie. Catherine had carried the baby out of the workhouse upon a folded shawl, and she and Thomas had walked west again through the long flat country of East Anglia, with their ballads in the leather case and the small new daughter, swaddled at the mother's breast. The year that followed had been one of their better years. They had moved back through the Midlands, from market town to market town, with the small Annie kept asleep in a wicker basket beside the open road. Thomas had been writing music-hall ballads as well as the older gallows broadsides, and his song-sheets had begun to sell well at the corners of the great towns. His name had begun to be known among the small printers of Goulston and of Wolverhampton, who would run off 400 or 500 copies of a new ballad in an afternoon and have them ready by the next market day. And in the cold middle of January in the year 1866, the small fair-going family had walked east to the assize town of Stafford for a particular event of the kind that the broadside trade had always lived upon. A young man called Christopher Robinson, 22 years of age, was to hang outside the county gaol on a winter morning for the murder of a young woman called Harriet Seeger at Wolverhampton in the summer before. The young Christopher Robinson had been Catherine Eddowes' own cousin on the side of one of her uncles. The hanging would draw a great crowd. The ballad describing the crime, written and printed in advance, would sell well to that crowd. Thomas Conway had written the ballad. Catherine had hawked it through the crowd that filled the long muddy street outside the gaol on the morning of the hanging, with her small printed sheets fluttering in her hand. She had walked among the people of Stafford and the watchers from the surrounding villages, and she had cried out the price of the broadside, and she had taken in the small coppers as the rope was made ready above the prison gate. She had not gone in to watch the hanging itself, but she had heard the long collective sigh of the crowd when the trap had fallen, and she had heard the bells of the parish churches of Stafford strike the slow morning hour in the cold January air. She had walked away from that street with her hands full of coppers. She had carried the printed broadsides in a folded apron at her waist, and when at last she and Thomas had returned to Goulston, he had ordered another 400 sheets from Sam Selman, the Church Street printer, and he had bought Catherine the price of a small flowered hat from a shop called Woolly's in the Goulston High Street. It had been their best small day of business together. There had not been many such days afterwards. Their second child was a son. He had been born around the year 1868, somewhere in the long sprawl of London. By this time the family had begun to drift more often back to the capital, where the work of the streets was less seasonal than the work of the country fairs, and where the small daughter Annie could be sent at last to a charity school. They had taken lodgings in Westminster for a time. Then they had moved south of the river to a small terraced house at 1 Queen Street in Southwark, where the census takers of the year 1871 had found them in the spring of that year. Catherine, then 28 years of age, had been registered in the parish book as a laundress. Thomas, then 34, had been registered as a pedlar. The two children had been written down on the page beside them. Their third child was another boy. He had been born on the 15th of August in the year 1873, at the workhouse of St. George the Martyr on Mint Street in the parish of St. Saviour, which lay in the long shadow of the railway viaduct that ran across Southwark toward the river. They had named him George. They had taken him back to their lodgings as soon as the workhouse had let them go. But the long, slow drift of their life together had begun, by then, to wear at the edges of their small family. Thomas Conway was a careful man with his money by the standards of the trade. He saved his pension. He did not, by every account, drink. Catherine drank. She had begun to drink as a young woman in the public houses of Wolverhampton, and she had not stopped, and the small chapbook earnings of her common-law husband had begun to disappear too often into the brass pewter mugs of the public houses along the Borough High Road. They had begun to quarrel. They had begun to fight. He had, by some accounts, begun to strike her in the small bitter hours of the early morning, when his patience had run out and her drink had taken hold of her speech. Her daughter Annie, growing up beside them, had remembered her mother's drinking in later years with a long, quiet resentment. Catherine's own sister Elizabeth, hearing of the marriage from a distance, had laid the blame instead at the husband's door for the violence she had heard rumoured between them. By the year 1880, the small family had moved north of the river again to a small house at 71 Lower George Street in the parish of Chelsea, and in the early months of the year that followed, the long arrangement between Catherine Eddowes and Thomas Conway had quietly come to its end. He had taken the two sons with him. She had taken the daughter Annie. They had separated their few small belongings between them. He had drawn his next pension under the name of Quinn. She had walked east across the river, into the long crowded streets of the East End of London, with her daughter beside her and a small bundle of her own held tightly in her right hand. The fairs of the English Midlands had gone on without them. The penny ballad printers of Goulston had gone on running off their 400 sheets at every market day. The young men of the Royal Irish had gone on serving their long years on the burning edges of the Empire, with their fevers and their pensions and their slow returns to the small streets of home. The cousin Christopher Robinson had lain these 15 years in the unmarked ground behind the wall of the Stafford County Gaol. The small flowered hat that Catherine had once worn back from Bilston had long since gone the way of all small flowered hats, into the pawnshops and out, and back to the pawnshops again, with its ribbons fraying and its silk flowers slowly fading in the long damp of the southern summers. And in the late spring of the year 1881, with her daughter Annie at her side, Catherine Eddowes had walked into the eastern parishes of London for the first time as a woman alone, with her old TC tattoo still fading slowly upon her left forearm, and her small bundle of belongings carried in her right hand, and the long ash of her 20 years upon the road still cooling in the small hollow of her shoulders. Cooling in the small hollow at shoulders. The gas lamps of the eastern streets had burned softly above her in the long blue evening of that first arrival. The bells of the great churches had rung the quarters out across the rooftops. The hansom cabs had clattered past her along the wet cobbles. The flower sellers had cried their evening prices from the corners of Aldgate, and the rain had come down upon the cobbles, soft and slow and patient, as it had come down upon her through every long evening of the 20 years that lay behind her. STPT. Chapter 6. Cooney's Lodging House. The street where the lodging house stood had been named for two old men of the 17th century. Their names had been John Flower and Gowan Dean. They had been bricklayers in the long quiet years before the Great Fire of London, and they had been hired by a Hertfordshire landowner called Fosson to build a long row of houses upon a small parcel of weaving ground at the eastern edge of the city. The ground had been called the Tenter Ground, because it had once held the long wooden frames upon which the silk weavers of the parish had stretched and dried their cloths. The houses that the two men had built had taken their two names, and from the spring of the year 1671 onward, the small lane along which they had been raised had been called Flower and Dean Street. 2 centuries had then passed across the cobbles of that small street. Through the long reign of Queen Anne, and the slow growth of the Georgian city, and the great explosion of London under the Victorian railways, Flower and Dean Street had been overbuilt, again and again, with smaller and smaller houses and tighter courts. The back gardens of the original tenements had been built upon for narrow inner courts. The inner courts had been built upon for shed-like dwellings. The shed-like dwellings had been crammed with families of 7 and 8 and 10. And by the 1860s the street had earned a reputation that had carried far beyond the East End. The reformer who had called it, in the year 1883, perhaps the foulest and most dangerous street in the whole metropolis, had not been the first to say it. He had only been the last in a long line of clergymen and journalists and visiting Americans and shaken-up members of Parliament. By the autumn of the year 1888, Flower and Dean Street had been packed almost end to end with common lodging houses. There were 31 of them along that single narrow street. They had been counted in the census of 1871, when 902 registered lodgers had been found sleeping under their roofs on a single given night. There had been many more sleeping there unregistered, on the long benches of the kitchens and the bare boards of the upstairs landings, in the small hours of every working morning of every year. At the eastern end of Flower and Dean Street, just past the corner of Brick Lane, stood the brick front of the house at number 55. It had been a common lodging house for many years before it had ever known the name of Cooney. The original keepers had been members of a local family called Smith, who had run a string of such houses in the streets around Brick Lane for 2 generations. By the year 1884, the house had been taken over by a man called John Cooney, then about 30 years of age, the husband of Elizabeth Smith and the new son-in-law of the old family. He had moved into the small house at number 54 next door with his wife and his small boy John, and he had taken charge of the long brick lodging house beside him. John Cooney was, by all the accounts of his neighbours, a respectable sort of businessman by the standards of Spitalfields. He owned a public house in Hanbury Street called the Sugarloaf, where his cousin, who would later become known to the music halls of London as the great star Marie Lloyd, was often to be found at the long polished bar. He had a steady hand for his lodgers, but he had a deputy to do the daily work of running the house at number 55. The deputy, in the autumn of 1888, was a quiet, steady man called Frederick William Wilkinson. He had been the deputy of Cooney's for some little while by that time, and he knew his lodgers by sight and by name, and he had a slow, careful eye for the small troubles of the street. The lodging house at number 55 was a tall, narrow brick building of 4 floors. It had a small flagstone passage at its front and a public kitchen at its back, with a great cast-iron range that burned day and night through every winter and every summer of the year. The kitchen had a long wooden table running down its centre, with rough benches set on either side. Above the table hung a long iron rail upon which the lodgers would drape their wet shawls and wet trousers to dry. The fire burned in the range, and the kettles hissed upon the hob, and the long iron pots simmered with the lodgers' broths and stews. The smell of the kitchen was a thick, warm smell of coal smoke, and boiled cabbage, and salt fish, and pipe smoke, with the soft underbreath of unwashed wool that hung beneath all of it. A few cats moved slowly along the walls. A few small mice moved more slowly still beneath the benches. A small deal door at the front of the passage led into the small room of the deputy, where Frederick Wilkinson kept his ledger and his coin-box upon a low wooden desk. The lodgers paid their coppers across the desk as they entered. The single bed in the upper dormitory cost 4d. For the night. The double bed in a small back rooms cost 8d. The deputy wrote each lodger's name in his ledger as the payment was made. He returned a small painted ticket with the number of the bed inked upon it in his own slow, careful hand. The deputy was the small, unspoken law of the house. He knew his regular lodgers. He kept the worst troublemakers out. He took in the new arrivals with a slow, careful look, and he turned away the ones whose pockets had been cut from the cloth of another man. Above the kitchen and the deputy's room there were 3 floors of dormitories. The dormitories were long, bare rooms, with the iron-framed beds set close beside one another, and the small windows giving onto the courts of Spitalfields below. Each bed had a thin mattress upon a sprung iron frame, with a single rough blanket and a single rough pillow. Each bed had a small numbered ticket nailed to its iron foot, by which the deputy could identify it for the lodger who had paid. Each bed slept one paying body. Sometimes a second body shared without paying when the night was cold and the deputy was looking elsewhere. It was into this house that the woman called Catherine Eddowes had walked one evening in the summer of the year 1881, with her bundle of small belongings in her right hand and the long shadow of her recent parting from Thomas Conway in her quiet face. She had paid her 4d. At the desk. She had taken her ticket from the deputy. She had walked through the warm kitchen and up the bare staircase to her single bed in the long upstairs dormitory, and on the next morning, when she had come down again to the kitchen for her cup of weak tea, she had set eyes for the first time on the man who had become her companion for the last 7 years of her life. His name was John Kelly. He was, by his own account, in the small interviews he gave to the press in the long sad weeks after her death, a labourer who earned his living jobbing about the great fruit markets of the city, Spitalfields Market, Covent Garden, Leadenhall, the Borough. He worked, when he could find the work, for a fruit salesman called Lambda, who kept his stalls at Spitalfields. He was Irish by long descent like Thomas Conway before him, but he had been raised in London, and he carried the long, flat London accent of his trade. He was a man of medium height, gentle in his manner, slow in his speech, with a soft face and the worn hands of a porter, and a habit of standing slightly stooped, as if he were always carrying a basket on his shoulder. Catherine had liked him quickly. He had liked her quickly back. The two of them had soon agreed, in the small, careful way of working people, to share their lodgings and their small earnings together. From the late summer of 1881 onward, they had taken a double bed at Cooney's lodging-house for 8d. A night when their pockets had allowed it, and a single bed each for 4d. When their pockets had been thinner. They had spent their evenings in the warm kitchen of the house, sitting together upon the long wooden bench, drinking their weak tea from tin cups, talking in the soft, slow voices of people who had found a small, calm corner of the world together. Catherine had taken his surname in the small way of common law that had not required a church or a register, and from that time forward most of the lodgers of Flower and Dean Street had known her as Kate Kelly. The deputy, Frederick Wilkinson, had grown to know her well. He described her, in the long interviews he later gave to the reporters from the inquest, as a steady and respectable lodger by the standards of the house. She did not drink to excess at the kitchen table, although she would sometimes return at a late hour from the public houses of Spitalfields and Aldgate with the slow walk of a woman who had taken more than she could carry. She was, in the words of those who had known her, a very jolly woman, always singing. She had a quick, small voice for the old songs of the country fairs of her younger years. She had a sharp, small wit for the small affairs of the lodging-house. She had a habit of laughing softly at the long, sad jokes of John Kelly, who had a way of telling them with his head tilted to one side and his eyes half closed. The other lodgers had liked her. The other lodgers had liked him too. They were known together along the small length of Flower and Dean Street as Kate and John of Cooney's, and the deputies of the other 30 lodging houses upon that small street had known them by sight as they walked the cobbles between the doorways. Their 7 years at Cooney's had passed in the long way of all such lives in the East End. They had risen each morning at the first cry of the deputy in the small hours. They had taken their breakfast at the long wooden table in the kitchen, with the bread and the dripping and the weak tea. They had walked out into the streets of Spitalfields by the first light. John Kelly for the great fruit markets where his work might be found. Catherine for the small streets of Aldgate and Houndsditch where she sold a few small things from a folded shawl. Bootlaces, lengths of ribbon, small bunches of watercress in the spring. They had returned to the lodging-house in the evenings. They had warmed themselves at the kitchen range. They had paid their pennies across the desk. They had slept their hours upon the iron beds of the upper rooms. They had quarrelled sometimes, in the slow, soft way of small partners. They had made it up again, in the slow, soft way of small partners. They had walked together, in the long autumns of every year, down into the hot fields of Kent for the picking season, and they had come back together to the lodging-house in the slow rain of late September. They had sung together, in the kitchen, on the evenings when they had a little money to spare. They had walked together to the small chapels of the East End on the Sunday mornings of their better weeks, and they had stayed in the kitchen and rested on the Sunday mornings of their poorer ones. They had grown older together, in the slow way of working people of the East End, with their small earnings turning slowly to pennies in the pockets of their coats, and the small voices turning slowly softer in the warm kitchen of the lodging-house at the end of every long day. And outside the door of the lodging-house, number 55 Flower and Dean Street, the long crowded life of Spitalfields had gone on around them. The barrows of the costermongers had rattled past at the first light of every morning. The bells of Christ Church, Spitalfields, had rung the quarters out across the slate roofs. The smoke of the chimneys had risen in the still air above the courts. The brass-handled doors of the public houses had swung open and closed through the long evenings. The lamp-lighters had walked their slow rounds with their long brass poles. The deputies of the 30 other lodging-houses upon that single small street had stood at their 30 open doors, taking the coppers of the new arrivals and handing them their small painted tickets for the night. And inside the warm kitchen of Cooney's, the great cast-iron range had burned through the long evenings, and the kettles had hissed upon its hob, and the long iron rail above the wooden table had hung heavy with the slow-drying shawls and trousers of the lodgers. The small voices of John Kelly and Catherine Eddowes had risen softly into the close warm air. The rain had hissed quietly against the small grimmed window at the back of the kitchen. The small oil lamps had glowed steady along the dark old walls, and the long damp Spitalfields evening had drawn its slow blue shawl about the rooftops of Flower and Dean Street, with the gas lamps burning soft along the curb, and the bells of the city sounding their quiet quarters out across the long sleeping courts. The Chapter 7. The Hopfields of Kent. The Hopfields of Kent had been one of the great quiet wonders of the English countryside for nearly 400 years. They'd been planted first under the late Tudor kings, when the new bitter beers of the Low Countries had begun to crowd out the old sweet alers of medieval England, and the great brewers of London and Canterbury had begun to call for hops by the wagon-load, to bitter their long copper vats. They had been planted in the long red clay fields of central Kent, where the rolling slopes ran down to the streams of the Medway and the Bult. They had been tended through 3 centuries by the slow, careful generations of Kentish farmers, with their long lattice frames of chestnut poles and their tall climbing bines and their oast houses, with the white painted cowls turning slowly upon the round red rooftops. By the long Victorian summers, the country southeast of Maidstone had become a kind of small green sea, with the dark green of the hop yards rolling away on every side, broken only by the orchards, and by the slow winding rivers, and by the small white spires of the parish churches that rose every few miles above the green. By the late 1800s, every September of every year, the Hopfields of Kent had drawn down from London a great army of pickers. Some had been gipsies of the long roads. Some had been farm labourers from the surrounding villages of the Weald. But by far the greater part, by the year 1888 perhaps 50,000 strong, had been the working poor of the East End of London, who had walked down by stages or had taken the cheap excursion trains from Charing Cross and London Bridge, who had carried their families in tied bundles upon their backs, and who had come for the brief hard fortnight of paid work in the open country before they returned again to the long winter of the streets. The trains had run southward each evening of late August and early September. packed with women in shawls and men in old coats and children carried upon their parents' shoulders. The smoke of the engines had risen above the long viaducts of South London. The carriages had clattered through Bromley and Tonbridge and Maidstone, with the singing of the East End women drifting out of the open windows into the warm summer night, and the children leaning out to watch the green country pass. Among the small Kentish villages, where the hop bines climbed to the September sky, there was a small farming parish that lay just over 5 miles to the southwest of the cathedral town of Maidstone. Its name was Hunton. It had been called in the older maps and the older parish registers by the medieval name of Huttingstone, the hunter's town, for the deer that had once been chased through the small woodlands above the Beelt. By the year 1888, it had been a hop-growing parish for many generations. Its small cottages stood among the orchards. Its lanes ran between long rows of climbing bines. Its small parish church, dedicated to St. Mary, kept its quiet round of bells across the long warm evenings of late August and early September, when the hops had ripened upon the wires and the picking had begun in earnest. It was to Hunton, in the late summer of the year 1888, that Catherine Eddowes and John Kelly had once again travelled, as they had done in every year of their 7 years together. They had walked out from Spitalfields by the long roads south of the river. They had stopped along the way at the small pawnshops of Maidstone, where Catherine had bought herself a thin, warm jacket, second-hand, and John had bought himself a pair of boots to replace the ones he had worn out upon the journey down. They had joined upon the road 2 other travellers known to them, a woman called Emily Birrell, who had been their friend for some years past, and her own common-law husband. The 4 of them had walked together into the small hop-yards of Hunton, and they had been taken on by the farmer of the place, at the standard rate of the year, which was a few small coppers for every bushel of picked hops measured at the end of each long working day. The work of hop-picking was not gentle work, but it was open work, and it was honest work, and the East End women who came down each year had always loved it for that. They stood beside the long wooden cribs that the farmer had set out between the rows of bines. They reached up to pull the climbing strings down from the chestnut poles. They stripped the bunches of pale green hop cones from the climbing stems, and let them fall into the deep wooden cribs at their feet. The cones had a soft bitter resin that smelled of beer and of evening woodlands. Their hands had grown stained with that resin by the second day of picking. Their fingers had grown cut by the rough, small bines, and the small dust of the cones had risen into their hair and into their eyes, and the long, hot September sun, when it had shown itself at all, had reddened their cheeks and their forearms. But they had laughed in the rows. They had sung the old songs of the East End at the breaks. They had eaten their bread and their cheese in the shade of the bines at noon. They had drunk weak ale from a shared earthen jug. They had taught the small children the old picking songs, and they had passed the small babies between them along the rows, and they had spoken in the warm, slow voices of women who had come away from the long brick walls of the East End for the only fortnight of open sky in their entire working year. At evening, the pickers had returned to the small wooden huts that the farmer had set up at the edge of the field. The huts were rough sheds of plank and canvas, with their floors strewn with clean straw and their roofs of tarred felt. Each family had its own small corner. Each corner had its small fire in a tin brazier outside the door, where the kettle was boiled and the small pot of stew was kept warm through the long evening. The children had played in the dust between the rows of the huts. The men had smoked their pipes upon overturned crates. The women had sat in their shawls, and they had sung the old songs of the road, and the stars had wheeled slowly above the orchards of Hunton in the soft warm middle of the September nights. But the long summer of 1888 had been wet beyond every memory of the trade. The hop bines had grown thin upon their poles. The hop cones had ripened poorly. A grey mould had spread through some of the gardens, and the cones from those gardens had been picked unripe and small. A short story in the London Evening News on the 12th day of September of that year had warned the working people of the East End that most of the gardens would yield no more than 200 or 300 weight of hops to the acre, where 700 weight had been the goal of a good year. The farmers had paid out poorly that September. The pickers had earned far less than they had in any year of recent memory. By the 3rd week of September, Catherine and John and their friends had stood in the small lanes between the bines and counted the small coppers in their hands, and they had known that the season had not paid them. It had been about then that the small steady quarrel between the 2 of them had begun. John Kelly had wanted to walk home to London. Catherine had wanted to stay a few days more. The hop fields had been thin, but the open sky had been wide, and the small huts at the edge of the field had been warmer in the soft early autumn nights than the back kittens of Cooney's lodging-house would be in the coming wet weeks of October. They had argued in the slow, careful way of people who had quarrelled many times before. They had not, in the words John Kelly later gave to a reporter from Lloyd's Weekly, got along too well in those final days. And in the end they had made a small decision, by the close of one of those long picking evenings, to start hoof it home, as he had put it himself, with their small earnings tied up in a folded handkerchief and the long road north before them. They had set out on foot from Hunton on the morning of the 26th of September, with the cold autumn wind on their faces and the long grey road north before them. Their friends Emily Burrell and her common-law husband had walked with them for the first part of the day. The four had stayed in company together as far as a small crossing of the roads in the long flat country above the Medway, where the way to London turned east toward the great city, and the way west bore on toward the spa town of Cheltenham. There the four had parted, with Emily Beryl pressing a small folded pawn ticket into Catherine's hand as a token of friendship. The ticket of a flannel shirt she had pawned weeks before at a small pawnshop near Whitechapel, which Catherine might, if the chance came her way, redeem on her own behalf when she returned at last to the East End. They had said their soft goodbyes upon the dusty road. Catherine had folded the small ticket away into a tin matchbox she carried in the pocket of her jacket. Catherine and John had turned east. The other two had walked away west into the long red afternoon of the southern country. The two of them had walked the long miles north through Maidstone and across the chalk downs above. They had walked through the long flat fields of the Weald. They had walked past the small hop-growing villages that turned now toward their own quiet rests, with their oast houses still drying the last small parcels of the year's harvest, and their cottage smoke rising in soft straight columns into the cool September air. They had walked, by stages, for the better part of 2 long days. They had slept where they could find shelter, once in a barn at the edge of a small orchard, once beside a haystack in a quiet field, once in the dry corner of an empty stable beside a small village inn. The autumn rain had come down upon them in the late afternoons. They had pulled their thin coats more tightly about their shoulders. They had spoken little. They had reached at last, on the late afternoon of the 27th of September, the long grey edges of the great smoky city of London. They had crossed the river by London Bridge in the slow drift of the evening crowd. They had walked through the small lanes of Southwark and across to the eastern side of the city. They had come at last, in the gathering evening, to a casual ward as a small parish house on Shoe Lane in the eastern edge of the city, where they had been given a corner to sleep upon for a single night. They had spent the next day looking for the small jobs and the small coppers that might pay for a bed at Cooney's lodging-house in the long brick streets to the east. They had not found much, and by the close of the 28th of September, with a last small jingle of their picking earnings spent down to a single sixpence between them, they had agreed upon the small careful arrangement that the working poor of London had always known by long habit. He would take 4pence and lay it down for a single bed at Cooney's, and she would take the remaining 2pence and go for a single bed at Cooney's, and she would take the remaining 2pence and go for a single night to the casual ward at the parish house on Mile End, and they would meet again in the morning. The hop fields of Kent had stood quiet beneath the long red sun of the late September evening that the two of them had left behind them. The bines, picked nearly clean, had hung limp upon the chestnut poles. The white cowls of the oast houses had turned slowly upon the round red rooftops, drying the last small parcels of the year's harvest. The small huts at the edges of the fields had begun to empty themselves of their lodgers, who had folded their straw mattresses and rolled their thin blankets and walked away by stages toward the long roads home. The smell of the hop resin had begun to fade from the open country. The orchards had begun to draw their leaves closer about them in the cold edges of the autumn evening, and in the small village of Hunton, the bells of the parish church of St. Mary had rung the slow 7 across the empty fields, with the wind soft in the chestnut hedges and the rooks calling sleepily from the high branches of the old elms above the lanes. The light of the September sky had begun to grow long and red across the western edges of the Weald. The roads back to London had begun to empty of their slow-walking pickers, who had taken their small earnings and turned their faces, for another year, toward the long blue evenings of the East End. The rain had come down soft and slow across the long red fields of Kent, as it had come down through the whole of that long wet summer, and the long quiet country had drawn closed about itself for the night. Chapter 8. The Pawn Ticket of Emily Birrell. Of all the small everyday institutions that ran the lives of the working poor of late Victorian London, none was more nearly universal than the pawn shop. There had been pawn shops in England since the long centuries of the Plantagenet kings, when the Lombard moneylenders of northern Italy had first set up their small benches in the lanes around Cornhill, with their 3 small gilded balls hung above the door as the badge of their old Florentine trade. By the 1800s that trade had spread into every parish of every working town in the kingdom. By the closing years of Victoria's reign, it had become the slow, steady heartbeat of the East End. There had been more than 700 licensed pawn shops in the metropolis by 1888, and the parishes of Whitechapel and Spitalfields had held more than their fair share of them, with their 3 gilded balls hanging at every other corner from Brick Lane down to the long edges of the docks. The shops of the trade had been alike in their general appearance from one parish to another. They had stood at the corners of the busiest streets with their 3 gilded balls hung outside the door, and their wide front windows curtained in dark green sarge to keep the small misery of their pledged goods from public view. They had been open from early in the morning until late at night, with the gas lamps burning behind the green sarge through the long dim afternoons. Inside, the front room had been narrow and cluttered, with a long wooden counter running down its centre, behind which the pawnbroker stood in his small dark waistcoat, with his eyeglass swinging upon a chain at his side. Behind him, the shelves had reached to the ceiling, packed close with the small folded bundles of pledged goods, the silk handkerchiefs and the brass candlesticks, the patched coats and the worn boots, the old wedding rings and the cracked watches, the Bibles in their tooled black leather and the lengths of unpicked cloth, the small lockets and the small christening cups, the long flannel shirts and the brown stuff dresses, all of them carefully labelled with the small folded paper tickets that bore the name and the address of the person who had pledged them. The trade had its own slow rhythms, which had been the rhythms of the working East End for many generations. On Monday mornings, the queue had formed before the shops had even opened their doors, with the wives and the mothers of the parishes standing in the cold light with their Sunday best coats folded across their arms, ready to pledge them for the small loans that would keep the families fed through the long week ahead. The pawnshops had called Monday by an old name. They had called it Blue Monday for the long blue sarge coats that came across their counters before the rest of the parish was yet awake. And on Saturday afternoons, when the small wages had been counted and the brown paper packets had been opened in the warm kitchens, the same wives and mothers had come back, with their pawn tickets folded in their hands, to redeem the coats and the lengths of cloth and the small christening cups before the church bells of Sunday rang above the rooftops. The brokers had grown rich upon this trade in the slow, careful way of small businessmen. They had charged their small interest upon the loans, set by the long statute of the realm at a halfpenny in the shilling. For every month a pledge was held. They had kept their long ledgers in their small back rooms. They had paid their assistants in small wages, and they had moved their auction stock at the end of every year and a day to the small backyard sales of the trade, where the unredeemed pledges of the unfortunate were sold on to the second-hand dealers of Petticoat Lane. They had been a steady fixture of the East End. They had been disliked by the social reformers, and they had been written about by the long, sober pens of the Pall Mall Gazette. But they had been beloved, in their small, careful way, by the working women of the parishes, for whom no other small institution had ever stood quite as patiently between the small kitchen and the workhouse door. In the parish of Spitalfields, one such shop had stood for many years at the corner of a small narrow lane called Church Street, just off the wider line of Commercial Street, where the great new market sheds had been raised 20 years earlier upon the old ground of the silkweavers' gardens. The shop had been owned and run by a man called Joseph Jones, who lived above his counter with his family, and who had built up a steady small trade through the long evenings of the 70s and the 80s. The house was numbered 31. The street still kept its old name in 1888, though it would later be renamed Fournier Street in the long quiet years to come. The small parish church of Christ Church, Spitalfields, with its high white spire designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor in the long quiet years before the second King George, stood at the far end of the lane. The bells of Christ Church rang the quarters out across the rooftops above the brass balls of Joseph Jones's shop, from before dawn until long after the close of business at night. The shop of Joseph Jones, like every other shop of its kind, had been built upon a single steady principle of trade. The working people of the parish would come in with some small object of small worth, a man's flannel shirt perhaps, or a pair of woolen trousers, or a small silver brooch given by a long-dead mother, and they would lay it down upon the counter. Joseph Jones would consider it through his eyeglass. He would write down a number in his ledger. He would count out the small loan upon the wooden counter in coppers or in silver. The pledged object would be folded carefully and labelled with the small paper ticket, and it would be carried away to the long shelves behind the counter. The customer would carry away the small folded paper of the ticket. He would carry away the loan in his closed hand. And then, in the days of the weeks that followed, the customer would either come back to redeem the pledge, or the customer would not, in which case the small object would stay upon the long shelves of the broker until the year-and-a-day rule had passed, after which it might be sold on at auction for whatever it would bring. It was at this shop, at the corner of Church Street in the parish of Spitalfields, that a woman called Emily Beryl had walked one summer afternoon in the late August of 1888, with a man's long flannel shirt folded carefully under her arm and the small clear sun of the East End falling slantwise upon her shoulders. She was a small, thin woman of the working class of London, in the long way of so many such women in those parishes. The records that survive of her life are scant. She had been seen in the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields in the years before. She had been known by sight to the keepers of one or two of the lodging-houses. She had moved across the long open road of England with her common-law husband each summer, picking the soft fruit and the hops and the small wages of the country seasons. She had given her address to Joseph Jones when he had taken in her flannel shirt that August afternoon, as 52 White's Row in the small narrow streets behind Commercial Street. The address had not been her real address. The pawnbrokers of that quarter had grown long used to false addresses upon their tickets, and they had no inclination to verify them. The flannel shirt was a small object. It was a man's working shirt, of the rough flannel cloth that the dockmen and the porters and the small labourers of the East End wore beneath their coats in the cold months. It was perhaps the only spare shirt that Emily Beryl's man had owned. It had been folded carefully across the counter. Joseph Jones had considered it. He had written down its number in the long careful column of his ledger. He had counted out the loan upon the wooden counter, 9 pence, in small copper coin. He had folded the shirt away to the long shelves behind him, and he had passed the small folded paper ticket across the counter into Emily Beryl's hand. The date upon the ticket was the 31st of August in the year 1888. The name written upon it was Emily Beryl. The address written upon it was 52 White's Row, which was, in the truth of the parish records, not where she lived at all. A few days later, the woman called Emily Beryl had walked out of the long brick streets of the East End, and down into the open country, with her common-law husband at her side, to the hop fields of Hunton in Kent. She had carried the small folded ticket with her, in the small inner pocket of her shawl or her jacket, in the long way of working women who carried such small papers tucked away against the small chance that the next piece of luck might be theirs. The man's flannel shirt had stayed at the shop of Joseph Jones, on a high shelf among the many small folded bundles of the pledged goods of the parish, with its small paper label pinned to one sleeve and the date of the 31st of August written across the top of the label in the slow, careful hand of the broker. It had stayed quiet through the long, warm September. It had been counted in the ledger at the end of each working day. It had moved no further than the small shelf upon which it had first been laid. The small ticket, however, had moved. It had moved down the long road into Kent. It had moved among the hop pickers' huts at the edge of the field at Hunton. It had moved through the long hot days of the picking and the long warm nights of the brazier fires, in the small inner pocket of Emily Beryl's shawl. And on the dusty road north from Hunton, in the slow afternoon of the 26th of September, when Emily Beryl had stopped at the small crossing of the roads and had reached into the pocket of her shawl, the small folded ticket had moved once more, from the hand of one working woman of the East End into the hand of another, in the small quiet ceremony of friendship that the working poor had always known by long habit. It had passed into the palm of a woman called Catherine Eddowes. It had been folded once again across its old creases. It had been pressed gently between the fingers of the receiver, who had thanked the giver with a soft, careful voice, and who had stood for a moment in the road with the small paper warming in her hand. Catherine had then opened the small tin matchbox that she carried in the pocket of her thin black jacket, and she folded the ticket inside it, and she had closed the small lid of the tin with the soft, careful click of a working woman who has just received a small piece of unexpected fortune. The matchbox was not a large tin. It had been a mustard tin, originally of the kind sold by the Coleman's Mustard Works for threepence at any small grocer's of the parish. Its painted label had long faded with the long handling of the years. Its small inner spring had grown soft with the long opening and closing of its lid. It held a small handful of matches at the bottom, for the lighting of pipes and of the small stove at Cooney's lodging house. And now it held also the small folded paper of Emily Beryl's pawn ticket, with a careful pencil hand of Joseph Jones upon its front, and the date of the 31st of August written above his small careful name. The two women had said their soft goodbyes upon the dust of the Kentish road. Emily Beryl had turned with her common-law husband, and walked away west into the long red afternoon, toward the Spart Owl of Cheltenham, with the wind soft in the hedges of the country lane, and the late September light falling long across the fields beside them. Catherine Eddowes had turned with John Kelly and walked away east toward the smoky northern edge of the great city of London, with the small mustard tin closed in the pocket of her jacket and the small folded ticket folded inside it. The shop of Joseph Jones had stood quiet that afternoon at the corner of Church Street in the parish of Spitalfields. The 3 small gilded balls had hung above his door in the soft autumn light. The bells of Christ Church had rung the slow afternoon hour above the slate roof-tops. The long shelves behind his counter had held the man's flannel shirt of Emily Beryl among their many small folded bundles, with its small paper ticket pinned to its sleeve. And the long, thin working trade of the East End, with its small loans and its small pledges and its small folded paper tickets, had gone on quiet about its long usual business. In the close warm afternoon of another late September day, in the long autumn of 1888, and in the small pocket of the small black jacket of the small woman walking east along the road from Maidstone, the small folded ticket lay quiet in the small painted tin, with the soft click of the lid closed above it, and the slow steady tread of the working road beneath it. Chapter 9. The Saturday in Aldgate. Saturday in the East End of London was the great day of the week. Through 5.5 long days the small wages of the working trades had been earned and counted and pressed into the hands of the dockmen and the porters and the laundresses and the printers in the brown paper packets of the foreman at the end of every working shift. And by the close of Saturday afternoon those small wages had begun to be spent again, at the long counters of every shop and stall and public house along Aldgate High Street, with the small coppers and the small silver pieces ringing across the wooden tables, and the marble bars in a long slow tide that ran from the dinner hour until the slow close of the working week. Aldgate High Street, on any Saturday afternoon in the autumn of the year 1888, would have been one of the busier thoroughfares of the great metropolis. It ran east from the heart of the City of London, just past the old corner of Aldgate Pump and the small parish church of St. Botolph's, down toward the long crowded streets of Whitechapel beyond. It carried the omnibuses and the hansoms and the brewers' drays. It carried the horse-drawn trams that ran on iron rails set into the cobbles. It carried the small barrows of the costermongers with their slow, careful loads of apples and pears and small bunches of late autumn flowers. It carried on every Saturday afternoon the working people of the East End, moving slowly along the wide thoroughfare in the long, thick currents of the late week, with their small wages in their pockets, and the slow soft warmth of the public houses calling them from every other doorway. By the close of the autumn of 1888, the gaslight along Aldgate High Street had begun to be lit a little earlier each evening. The shopkeepers had begun to put up their wooden shutters against the dusk by the close of the working day. The bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch had rung the quarters out across the rooftops, from before noon to long after midnight. The smell of the public houses had drifted out from their swinging brass-handled doors. The long warm smell of beer and pipe smoke, and the small barrels of gin standing along the inner walls. And the small wages of the working poor had drifted, slowly but steadily, across the long marble bars of those public houses into the small careful tills of the landlords. It was into this long Saturday tide that Catherine Eddowes had walked, at about 8 o'clock in the morning of the 29th of September, on her way back to Cooney's lodging-house from her single thin night at the casual ward of the Mile End, Old Town Workhouse a short distance to the east. She had passed her single night upon a wooden bench in the long common ward, with a thin grey blanket over her shoulders, and the long, slow breathing of the other paupers around her. She had washed her face in the cold washer of the washroom at the close of the early morning. She had walked back through the small grey streets of Whitechapel in the first light of the day, with her thin black jacket pulled close about her shoulders, and the small mustard tin still in her pocket, and she had come at last to the front passage of the lodging-house at number 55, Flower and Dean Street. She had met John Kelly at the small front passage of the house. They had reunited in the small, quiet way of small partners who had been parted for only a single night. The pair of John's boots had been pawned the day before at the shop of Joseph Jones in Church Street, just around the corner from the lodging-house, pawned for 2 shillings and 6pence in the false name of Jane Kelly of 6 Dorset Street, which had been neither her name nor her address. The boots had bought them their separate beds for the previous night. Now, in the slow morning of Saturday, the small remainder of the loan had to feed and shelter them both for another full day at least. The small folded mustard tin in Catherine's pocket had grown a little heavier through the night, with the small second pawn ticket for the boots now folded inside it beside the older ticket of Emily Burrell. They had walked together into the warm public kitchen at the back of the lodging-house. The great cast-iron range had been burning, as always. The kettles had been hissing upon the hob. The deputy Frederick Wilkinson had seen them between 10 and 11 o'clock in the kitchen, sitting at the long wooden table with their cups of weak tea and their small dry bread, talking softly to one another in the long, slow voices of small partners who had been hungry for many years. Wilkinson had remembered the morning later for the long, careful interviews he had given to the reporters. They had been quiet, he had said. They had been steady. They had been weary from the long walk back from Kent. They had not, by his account, been quarrelling. By the long middle of the morning, however, the small remainder of the boots money had nearly gone. There had been the breakfast at Cooney's. There had been a small loaf of bread bought at the corner. There had been the small pewter pot of beer that John Kelly had drunk slowly at the long bar of a public house on Brick Lane, and there had been nothing else. They had needed, by the slow turning of the early afternoon, to find another small piece of money before the long evening came down upon them. Catherine had said that she would walk south across the river, to the parish of Bermondsey, where her grown daughter Annie now lived with her husband, a young gunmaker named Louis Phillips, in a small terraced house in the long working streets of Southwark. Catherine had said that she would ask Annie for a small loan. She had said that she would be back by 4 in the afternoon. They had parted in Houndsditch at about 2 o'clock that afternoon. John Kelly had remembered the moment later, in the long quiet interviews he had given to the reporters from Lloyd's Weekly and the East London Observer. He had been worried for her. The killings of the late summer had still been on every doorstep. The patrols of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee had still been walking the courts in their noiseless boots through every night. He had asked her, before they had parted, to be careful. She had laughed at him, in the slow, soft way of a woman who had walked the streets of the East End for the long, quiet years. She had said, in the small, careful words that he had repeated later to the press, that she would be home by 4 o'clock at the latest. She had walked away from him along the long line of Houndsditch in the soft afternoon light. He had walked back toward the lodging-house at Cooney's. They had not seen one another again. She had not gone to Bermondsey. Her grown daughter Annie had, some little time before, moved out of the small terraced house in Southwark to a new lodging at an unknown address in the long way of working families of the East End. Catherine would have walked south across London Bridge, perhaps, in the slow, soft afternoon. She would have walked through the small lanes of Bermondsey toward the old address. She would have found the front door closed against her. She would have asked along the small street for the new address. She would have been given a vague answer, or no answer at all. And then, in the small turning of the late afternoon, with the light beginning to lengthen across the river and the bells of the city beginning to strike the 4:15, she would have turned and walked back across the bridge into the long crowded streets of the eastern parishes. What she did in the long hours between her parting from John Kelly at 2 in the afternoon, and her appearance drunk and laughing, on Aldgate High Street at about 8:30 in the evening, no one ever knew for certain. She would have walked, perhaps, the long streets of Whitechapel and Aldgate, with her small thin jacket pulled about her shoulders and the small mustard tin still in her pocket. She would have stopped, perhaps, at 1 or 2 of the public houses along the Whitechapel Road. She would have spoken, perhaps, with 1 or 2 of the women she had known by sight in the long years of the lodging houses. She would have taken a small pot of gin here and a small pot of beer there, and the small loose coppers that some kind stranger had pressed into her hand at the corner of the bar. By 8:30 in the soft evening of Saturday, the 29th of September, the woman called Catherine Eddowes had found herself outside the wooden shutters of a small shop front at No. 29 Aldgate High Street. She had drunk far more than she had eaten through the long afternoon. She had begun, by the slow turning of the early evening, to give a small drunken imitation of a fire engine to the small gathered crowd of Saturday night passers-by, with her arms swinging slowly at her sides, and her thin voice raised in the long, slow imitation of the bell. The small crowd had laughed. She had taken a small bow, and then she had lain down upon the wet pavement, in the soft, slow way of a woman whose legs had at last given out beneath her, and she had gone quietly to sleep upon the cobbles. It had been about then that a constable of the City of London Police, walking his beat eastward along Aldgate High Street, had come around the corner and noticed the small gathered crowd. His name was Louis Robinson. He wore the heavier blue of the city uniform, with the small red braided collar of his force, and the badge of the corporation upon his reinforced helmet, and the long number 931 stitched in white upon the collar of his coat. He had walked through the small crowd with the slow, careful tread of the city beat. He had looked down at a small thin woman asleep upon the wet pavement. He had asked the crowd, in the slow, careful voice of his trade, whether any of them knew her or knew where she lived. None of them had. He had bent down. He had pulled her up to her feet. He had leaned her against the wooden shutters of the shop. She had slid sideways down the shutters and onto the pavement again, in the slow, soft way of a woman who could not stand for herself. Constable Robinson had summoned the help of his colleague, City Constable George Simmons, number 959. Together the two men had brought the woman called Catherine Eddowes to her feet between them. They had walked her, with her small thin arms across their broad blue shoulders, the short distance north along the back streets, toward the long brick front of the Bishopsgate Police Station. The small crowd had broken up behind them in the soft autumn evening. The shop front at number 29 Aldgate High Street had stood quiet again, with its wooden shutters closed against the gathering dusk. The bells of some Betolphs at the corner of Houndsditch had rung the slow 3/4 of the 8th hour out across the rooftops. The gas lamps had hissed quietly above the wet cobbles, and the long Saturday tide of the East End had moved on around them, with the public houses still pouring their long warm light into the doorways, and the small wages of the long working week still ringing softly across the marble bars of every parish from Aldgate to Mile End. Chapter 10. The Cells at Bishopsgate. The Bishopsgate Police Station of the City of London Police had been one of the smaller police houses of the small square mile, built of the same brown London brick as every other police house in the metropolis, with its blue lamp hung above the front door and its small numbered sign set into the brickwork beside it. It had stood along the eastern line of Bishopsgate, in the narrow streets between Houndsditch and Liverpool Street, where the long quiet warehouses of the city pressed close against the long crowded courts of Spitalfields. It had been built in the early years of the city police force, soon after the Long Act of Parliament of 1839, and it had been kept in good slow repair by the corporation through the long Victorian decades that followed. By the autumn of the year 1888, it had been a familiar small landmark to the working people of the eastern edge of the city, with its blue lamp burning steadily through every long evening above the heavy iron-studded door of its front entrance. Inside the front door of the station there had been a small front passage, lit by a single gas lamp upon a brass bracket beside the door. The passage had opened into a small charging room at its back, where the station sergeant kept his long wooden desk against the inner wall, and where the long ledger of the prisoners was kept open upon a small inclined writing slope of polished oak. The charging room had been bare in its furnishings. A long bench had run along one wall, upon which the prisoners might sit as their names were taken down. A small black stove had stood against the back wall, with a kettle upon its hob. A long row of brass hooks had been mounted above the bench, upon which the keys to the small cells at the back of the building had hung in their numbered order. A small clock had ticked steadily upon the wall above the desk. The light of the gas lamp had fallen softly upon the long pages of the open ledger. Beyond the charging room, a small wooden door had led into the long flagstone passage of the cells. The cells had been small and narrow, each about 6 feet by 9, with a single small high window covered by an iron grating, a single small wooden bench fixed to one wall, and a single small wooden door with a small iron grille set into it at the height of a constable's eye. The walls had been whitewashed, but the whitewash had grown dim with the long handling of the years, and the long shadows of the gas lamps in the corridor had thrown the small high windows into deep silhouette against the night beyond. There had been no comfort in the cells. There had been no comfort intended in the cells. They had been the slow holding places of the small working unfortunates of the city, who had been brought in for the small public offences of the long week. The drunkenness, the small fights, the small petty thefts that had drawn the slow notice of a passing constable. It was into this small police house, at about 8:45 in the evening of the 29th of September, The city police constables Louis Robinson and George Simmons had brought the woman called Catherine Eddowes, held up between them with her small thin arms across their broad blue shoulders. They had walked her through the front door of the station. They had brought her through the small front passage into the charging room. They had stood her up before the long wooden desk of the station sergeant with their gloved hands at her shoulders to keep her upright. The station sergeant on duty that evening had been a man named James George Byfield, who had been a sergeant at the city police for some good many years by that time, and who knew the long quiet rhythms of his charging room by long careful habit. Sergeant Byfield had taken up his pen. He had asked the woman before him for her name. She had laughed softly. She had said, in the slow, drunken voice of a woman who had drunk far too much across the long Saturday afternoon, that her name was Nothing. The sergeant had written down the small word in the long ledger, and had let her pass for the moment. He had directed the two constables to walk her through to the back passage, to one of the small cells at the back of the building, where she might be left to sober up. The two constables had walked her, with their slow, steady tread, along the small flagstone passage. They had stopped at the small wooden door of the cell. They had unlocked the door. They had taken her inside. They had set her gently down upon the small wooden bench that ran along the wall. They had stepped back. They had closed the door. They had turned the small iron key in the lock. By a little before 9 o'clock, Catherine Eddowes had fallen to a deep sober sleep upon the small wooden bench of her cell. Constable Robinson had looked in upon her at about 10 minutes to 9 through the small iron grill at the height of his eye. He had reported in the small notebook he had kept upon his person that she was asleep, and that the small close air of the cell smelled strongly of drink. He had turned away from the grill. He had walked back through the long flagstone passage. He had gone back to his beat through the long quiet streets of the eastern city. At a little before 10 o'clock that evening, a new constable had come on duty in the charging room. His name was George Henry Hutt. He was the gaoler of the station for that night's shift, and the long quiet ward of the small cells was now his particular charge. He was a slow, careful man of middle years, with the long, quiet manner of a constable, who had spent many of his working hours in the small holding places of the city. He had taken over the long ring of cell keys from his colleague who had gone off duty. He had stood the kettle upon the hob of the small black stove. He had walked, in the slow, careful round of his evening, down the long flagstone passage of the cells, looking in upon each of his small charges through the small iron grills of the small wooden doors. When Constable Hutt had looked in upon Catherine Eddowes at his first round, she had still been asleep upon the small wooden bench. He had marked it in his small notebook. He had walked on to the next cell, and the next, and the next, and he had come back to his small wooden chair beside the stove in the charging room. He had taken up the kettle. He had poured himself a small tin cup of tea. He had sat down in the slow, quiet way of his trade, and had begun to wait for the long, slow turning of the night. The long, quiet hours of the cell had drawn slowly across the woman within. The soft, slow weight of her sleep had carried her through the long 9th and the long 10th hours of the night. The bells of the city churches had rung the quarters out across the rooftops above the police house. The gas lamps in the small flagstone passage had hissed quietly through the long midnight. The small high window of the cell had grown dark with the long autumn rain that had begun to come down again upon the rooftops above. And inside the cell, the small thin woman had slept her slow steady sleep upon the small wooden bench, with the long drink slowly leaving her, and the cold sober quiet of the long night slowly taking its place inside her. By 1/4 midnight, the gaoler had heard through the small iron grill of her cell the soft sound of a small voice. She had been singing. The song was an old one, of the kind that the working women of the East End had sung at the country fairs in the long quiet summers of their younger years. Her voice had been small and a little hoarse from the long drink of the afternoon, but it had carried softly down the long flagstone passage of the cells. Constable Hutt had paused at his small wooden chair to listen. He had marked it in his small notebook. He had not gone into her. He had let her sing. At about 1/2 midnight, she had called out from inside the cell. She had asked the gaoler, in a soft, careful voice, when she was going to be let out. Constable Hutt had walked down the long flagstone passage with the slow, careful tread of his trade. He had stopped at the small wooden door of her cell. He had looked in through the small iron grill. He had replied, in the slow, careful voice of his office, that she would be released when she was capable of taking care of herself. She had answered him back through the small iron grill of the door that she could do that now, He had not, at that moment, agreed with her. He had walked on back along the passage. He had let her sit. At a few minutes before 1 o'clock in the morning, Sergeant Byfield in the charging room had instructed the gaoler to go through to the back passage and see whether any of the prisoners were now fit to be released. Constable Hutt had taken up a long ring of cell keys. He had walked back down the small flagstone passage. He had stopped at each small wooden door in turn. He had opened the grille. He looked in upon each small sleeping body, and at the door of the cell of the woman who had given her name as Nothing. He had found her sitting now upon the small wooden bench, sober and quiet, with her thin black jacket pulled closely about her shoulders and her small folded hands upon her knees. He had unlocked the small iron door. He had taken her by the elbow. He had walked her, in the slow careful tread of his trade, back along the long flagstone passage of the cells, and through the small wooden door into the warm light of the charging room. The sergeant had taken up his pen at the long wooden desk. He had asked the woman before him, for the second time that night, for her name. She had given him this time a different answer. She had said that her name was Mary Ann Kelly, and that she lived at the address of 6 Fashion Street, which was, in the truth of the parish records, not where she lived at all. The sergeant had written the small false name and the small false address down in the long ledger beside the small word, nothing that he had written some hours before. He had closed the long ledger. He had told her that she was free to go. She had stood quietly at the long wooden desk. She had taken her small folded shawl from the bench beside the desk. She had buttoned her thin black jacket against the long night beyond the door. She had turned toward the small front passage of the station. The gaoler had walked her toward the heavy iron-studded door of the front entrance. She had stopped for a moment at the door. She had asked him, in the small soft voice of a woman who has come out of a long sleep, what the time was. He had told her, in the slow careful voice of his office, that it was too late for her to get anything more to drink. She had laughed softly. She had said, in the slow careful words, that the gaoler had remembered for the long careful interviews he later gave to the reporters at the inquest. "Good night, old cock." He had nodded to her. He had opened the heavy iron-studded door for her. He had let her pass through. She had stepped out into the soft autumn rain of the small hours. She had stood for a moment beneath the blue lamp of the station, with the rain coming down soft and slow upon her thin black jacket and her small folded shawl. She had turned in the slow careful tread of a woman who has been in a small holding place for the long 4 hours and a half of her sober return to herself. She had turned left. The long shortest route to her lodging house at Cooney's would have been to her right, north up Bishopsgate and across to Flower and Dean Street, through the small narrow lanes of Spitalfields. She did not turn right. She turned left. She walked, in the slow careful tread of her own small choosing, in the general direction of Aldgate. The blue lamp of the Bishopsgate Police Station burned softly above the heavy iron-studded door behind her. The gas lamps along the wet pavement hissed quietly in the soft autumn rain. The bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch rang the slow first hour of the morning across the rooftops of the city. The long quiet streets of the eastern parishes stretched away before her into the soft heavy weight of the small hours, and the rain came down upon the cobbles, soft and slow and steady, as it had come down upon them through the whole of that long wet September of the year 1888. Chapter 11. The witnesses at Church Passage Duke's Place lay along the eastern edge of the City of London, between the old corner of Houndsditch and the long stone face of Aldgate High Street, in the small Jewish quarter that had grown up over the long Victorian decades within the shadow of the great synagogue of London. It was a small street. It carried only the narrow lane of Mitre Street running out from its southern side, and the small covered passage of Church Passage running out from beside it, and the long quiet stretch of Bevis Marks running away to its west. The great synagogue of London, built in the 18th century by the Ashkenazi community of the parish, stood along its southern length, with its long stone front looking out across the wet cobbles. By the small hours of the morning of the 30th of September in the year 1888, Duke's Place had grown nearly silent. The trams had stopped running long before. The shop windows had been closed and shuttered. The gas lamps along its short length had burned down to their quiet quarter flames. The bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch and Aldgate had just run the half-hour after 1 in the morning across the wet rooftops. The small light still falling onto the street had come from one of the buildings along it. The building was numbered 16 and 17 Duke's Place. It was a tall, narrow brick house of 3 stories, with its front room lit from within by the soft yellow glow of gas mantles and the long warm light of a small coal fire upon its hearth. The house was the meeting place of a small social club called by its members the Imperial Club. Its members were tobacconists and butchers and tailors and furniture dealers and small commercial travellers, drawn for the most part from the Jewish immigrant community of the eastern parishes, who gathered each evening at its long polished tables to play cards and dominoes, to drink small glasses of porter and small cups of strong tea, and to talk in the slow, careful voices of working men who had finished their long week of trade and had come together for the small, slow comforts of company. On the evening of Saturday, the 29th of September, 3 members of the Imperial Club had stayed later than the others. The first of the 3 was a man named Joseph Lawende, a Polish-born commercial traveller in cigarettes who lived in a small house at 45 Norfolk Road in Dalston, several miles to the north of the city. He was a man of 41 years of age, married for 15 years to a woman called Annie Rosenthal, whom he had wed at the new synagogue, the father of a large brood of growing children. He had come to England from Warsaw as a young man in the early 70s, fleeing the long, quiet hardships of the Russian Empire in the long, quiet way of so many young men of his community, and he had built up a small, steady trade in his cigarette business out of premises in St. Mary Axe. He was a small, careful man, with a slow, careful eye and a long, quiet manner. The second of the 3 was a man called Joseph Chaim Levy. He was a butcher by trade, a man of about 37 years, who kept a small shop and lived above it at number 1 Hutchinson Street, in the long, old streets of Aldgate. He was, by all the accounts of those who knew him, a quiet, careful man, with the steady hands of his trade and the careful conscience of a man who had grown up in the narrow streets of the parish. The third was a furniture dealer called Harry Harris, a younger man than the other 2, who had walked across to the club that evening from his lodgings nearby. He was a quieter man still. He had not, in the long, careful interviews he had given after that night to the reporters from the East London papers, said much at all. The 3 of them had played whist together at one of the small polished tables in the long back room of the club. They had drunk small glasses of porter. They had smoked their small pipes of strong tobacco. They had spoken in the low, careful voices of working men. They had stayed later than they had planned to stay because the autumn rain had come down upon the streets outside in a long, steady fall through the late hours of the evening, and they had no great wish to walk out into the wet, cold streets of the morning before the rain had eased. They had watched the small, ornate clock that hung upon the wall above the bar. They had checked the hour against the small gold pocket watch that Joseph Lawende carried in his waistcoat upon a thin gold chain. By a little after the half hour of 1 in the morning, the rain had begun to ease into a soft mist along the rooftops, and the 3 of them had risen from their small polished table, and they had picked up their hats and their long coats, and they had begun to make their way out toward the long, heavy front door of the club. They had passed through the small front passage of the building. They had stepped out under the small brass-bracketed gas lamp above the door. They had turned to begin their walk down Duke's Place toward the corner of Aldgate, where Joseph Levy would turn off toward his shop in Hutchinson Street, where Harry Harris would turn off toward his lodgings, and where Joseph Lawende would walk on toward the omnibus stand to take the long, late tram back toward Dalston. The wet cobbles had glistened beneath their boots in the soft light of the gas. The rain had eased to a fine, slow mist above the rooftops. The bells of St. Botolph's had just struck the half past the first hour of the morning in the long, wet air. The small mist had drifted in along the long line of Duke's Place. The shutters of the small Jewish shops along the southern side had stood quiet against the night. About 15 yards south of the door of the club, where the long narrow opening of Church Passage cut its small dark way southwest between 2 buildings toward the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square beyond, the 3 men had come quietly down the pavement together. There at the entrance to the passage they had seen a small figure of a man and a small figure of a woman standing together in the soft, uneven light of the gas. The 2 had been talking in hushed voices. The woman had been standing with her back to the 3 men. Her hand had been resting upon the man's chest, in the small, soft way of a woman who is talking quietly with someone she has only just met. The woman had been dressed in a black jacket of the kind worn by the working women of the East End, with a small black bonnet upon her head and a small folded shawl beneath her arm. The man had stood facing her, with his head bent slightly down toward her, in the small, soft way of a man who is listening more than he is speaking. The 3 men of the Imperial Club had glanced at the small couple for the briefest of moments, as they had passed them. The furniture dealer Harry Harris had not given them more than the smallest portion of his attention. He had been looking the other way along the street toward his lodgings. He had remembered nothing of them afterwards. The butcher Joseph Levy had glanced once at the two of them and had then dropped his eyes. He had not liked the look of the man. He had said softly to his companions in the slow, careful voice of a man who keeps a small shop and walks alone home at night, that he did not care for the look of such characters at such an hour, and that the small, narrow court ought to be watched. He had walked on past them with his head turned down toward the pavement, in the quiet way of a quiet man, who had no wish to give offence by looking too long. Only the commercial traveller, Joseph Loende, had taken a clear small look at the two of them as he had passed. He had glanced across at the small face of the man, who had stood facing him beneath the soft, uneven light. He had glanced at the small figure of the woman, who had stood with her back to him, with the soft hand still resting upon the man's chest. The look had been brief. The light along Duke's Place had not been good, but Loende had been a careful man, and his careful eye had taken in such details as the light had given him in the small turning of that quiet moment. The man had been, in Loende's later careful account given at the long quiet inquest before the city coroner, a man of about 30 years of age, of medium height, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, of fair complexion, with a small fair moustache upon his upper lip. He had been wearing a loose-fitting jacket of the pepper and salt cloth that the small dock labourers and the small porters of the East End had often worn at their work, with a grey cloth cap upon his head, of the peaked sort that was common in the parish, and the small red kerchief tied around his neck in the soft careless knot that the merchant sailors had often worn ashore. The general look of him, in Loende's careful description, had been the look of a sailor. He had not been a tall man. He had not been a short one. He had been the kind of man that a working person in the East End might have passed at the entrance to a dozen narrow courts on a dozen Saturday evenings without thinking of him twice. Loende had said, in the slow, careful voice of his testimony, that he doubted whether he would ever be able to know the man again if he saw him. The three men had walked on past the couple in the soft mist of the late hour. They had reached the corner of Duke's Place and Aldgate within another minute. They had said their soft good nights to one another. Joseph Levy had turned south toward his shop in Hutchinson Street. Harry Harris had turned toward his lodgings beyond. Joseph Loende had walked west toward the omnibus stand at the corner of St. Botolph's. The three of them had carried their small, careful memories with them through the long, wet hours of the early morning. They had not in the moment given the small couple at the entrance to the passage another thought. Their small, careful evening at the Imperial Club had been the only evening of their long working week. The small, slow walk home had been the only slow walk of the morning. The man and the woman at the entrance to Church Passage had stood quiet behind them in the soft, uneven light of the gas. The small folded shawl had hung beneath the woman's arm. The small black bonnet had sat upon her head. The small fair moustache of the man had caught the soft light of the lamp above them. The two of them had spoken softly together for some small moment longer, and then, in the slow, careful way of the small movements of the small hours, the man and the woman had turned together toward the narrow dark mouth of Church Passage, and they had walked side by side into the long covered passage that led southwest toward the small enclosure of Mitre Square beyond. Church Passage was a long, narrow, covered way of stone and brick that ran between the buildings along Duke's Place and the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square. It was scarcely 6 feet in width along its length. It was paved with the rough cobbles of the long old streets. It was lit by no single gas lamp along its length. Its walls had been built against the south wall of the great synagogue of London on one side, and against the long brick wall of an old commercial building on the other. The passage had been there since the medieval times, when the cloister of the old Holy Trinity Priory had stood upon the ground beyond. The local people had called it, in the older years of the parish, by the older name of Dark Entry. The newer name had not changed its old quiet character. The passage led southwest into the small enclosure of Mitre Square in a slow, short descent, and a person walking through it from Duke's Place could see the soft, uneven light of the gas lamps of the square at the far end, but could see nothing along the long covered length of the passage itself. The bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch had finished their slow striking of the half past the first hour of the morning across the rooftops. The soft mist of the easing rain had drifted in along the long line of Duke's Place. The wet cobbles had glistened beneath the soft, uneven light of the gas lamps. The small, ornate clock upon the wall of the long back room of the Imperial Club, where the three men had played their long whist game and drunk their small porters, had ticked steadily on through the small hours of the new day. The members who had stayed behind had begun to gather up their cards and their small pipes in their long coats. The deputy of the club had begun to turn down the gas above the long polished tables. The long covered passage of Church Passage had stood quiet between the two buildings of its long medieval line. The small inner enclosure of Mitre Square had lain beyond it, dark and empty in the soft uneven light of its 3 gas lamps, with the small light of the warehouse watchman's lamp still burning softly behind the small window of the bonded warehouse along its eastern side. A small rain had come down upon the rooftops above the long covered passage, soft and slow and steady. The long quiet of the small hours had held the small narrow places of the eastern city in its long patient hands. S. Civic. Chapter 12. The Lantern in Mitre Square. The small inner enclosure of Mitre Square lay at the very edge of the City of London, behind its 3 narrow stone passages, in the slow quiet of the small hours of the morning of the 30th of September, in the year 1888. It was a small square. It measured no more than 77 feet on its longer side and barely 80 feet across. It was lined with the tall blank fronts of warehouses on 3 of its sides, and with the small low fronts of empty houses on the 4th. 3 narrow ways led into it. The widest came in from Mitre Street to the south. The narrowest came in through St. James' Passage to the northeast. The longest came in through the small covered length of Church Passage to the northeast, between the south wall of the great synagogue and the long brick wall of the old commercial building beside it. A single small family lived inside the square, at the small house numbered 3 Mitre Square, where a city constable named Piers Square kept his wife and his children behind his small drawn curtains. The rest of the square was given over to the long trade of warehousing and to the small empty houses of the south-west corner. The square was lit by 3 small gas lamps at 3 of its 4 corners. The 4th corner, the south-west, held no lamp at all. The dark of that corner had pressed in upon the small enclosure on every evening that the gas lamps had burned. The dark of that corner had been the deepest dark of Mitre Square for as long as the warehouses around it had stood. By the small hours of the 30th of September, with the autumn rain still drifting softly down upon the slates of the warehouses above, and the small flames of the 3 gas lamps burning low in their hooded brackets, the dark of the south-west corner had grown almost complete. A man could have stood within it at 5 paces and not been seen from the centre of the square. There had been one man walking that small enclosure at quarter-hour intervals through the long hours of the night. His name was Edward Watkins. He was a police constable of the City of London Police, holding the long collar number 881. He had come on duty in the small charging room of the Bishopsgate Police Station at a few minutes past 10 o'clock the previous evening, and he had walked his small careful beat through the small streets of the eastern city for the long quiet hours that had followed. His beat had taken him along Duke Street through Heneage Lane, through a small portion of Berry Street, then through Creechurch Lane into the long stone face of Leadenhall Street, along Leadenhall Street into Mitre Street, then into Mitre Square, around the square, back into Mitre Street, then into King Street, along King Street, into St. James' Place, around St. James' Place, and thence into Duke Street again. The whole beat had taken him between 12 and 14 minutes to walk. He had walked it again and again through the long hours of the night. Within the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square, a single small light had burned through the long hours of the night. The light had come from the small wooden door of the warehouse of Kearley and Tunge, which had stood along the eastern side of the square. The warehouse had been one of the great bonded warehouses of the City of London for many years. It held tea and coffee and sugar from the long shipping routes of the Empire, locked away in the small back rooms behind the heavy iron-bound doors. It had its own night watchman through every hour of the night. The watchman on duty for the long shift of the 30th of September was a man called George Morris. George Morris was a man of late middle years, with the long, careful manner of a man who had served his trade for a long time. He had been, in his earlier life, a constable of the Metropolitan Police, and he had retired from that service some years before to take up the quieter trade of the night watchman in the small bonded warehouses of the city. He sat at his small wooden desk inside the door of the warehouse through the long hours of the night, with his small lamp burning steadily upon the desk beside him, with his small kettle hissing softly upon the small hob of the iron stove in the corner, with his long ledger open before him upon the polished wood of the desk. He had taken to making, in the long quiet hours of the night, the small careful jokes of a retired constable. He had sent to one of the small group of men with whom he had drunk a small pot of beer the night before. half in jest, half in the slow, careful way of a watchman with a long memory, that he wished the killer of the eastern parishes would come around Mitre Square, for he would give him a good doing if he should. At about 1:30 in the morning, Constable Watkins had walked once more into the small enclosure of Mitre Square, along the wide mouth of Mitre Street. He had carried his small bull's-eye lantern at his belt. He had carried the slow, steady manner of a constable who had walked the same small streets a dozen times that night. He had passed his careful eye across the small square. He had walked around its centre. He had looked into the dark southwest corner. He had looked into the small narrow mouth of Church Passage. He had looked into the small narrow mouth of St. James Passage. He had seen nothing. He had heard nothing. The square had been quiet and empty. He had turned out of it along Mitre Street toward Aldgate, and he had walked away into the next 12 to 14 minutes of his long, careful beat. At a few minutes before 1:45 in the morning, another constable of the City Police had walked along the long line of Duke Street and as far as the entrance of Church Passage. His name was James Harvey. He held the long collar number 964. His beat ran along the streets to the north of Mitre Square, through Houndsditch and Bevis Marks and the small lanes of the Jewish Quarter, and back along the long line of Aldgate. He had walked down the entrance of Church Passage as far as the small mouth of it. He had not entered the small enclosure of the square. He had stood for a small moment at the dark mouth of the passage. He had looked along its small length toward the soft light of the gas lamps of the square. He had heard nothing. He had seen nothing. He had turned, in the slow, careful tread of his long beat, and he had walked back out of the passage along its long covered length toward Duke Street, and he had carried on into the next slow turning of his small, careful patrol. At a few minutes before 1:45 in the morning, Constable Watkins had come once more around the long, careful turn of his slow beat. He had walked along Leadenhall Street through the long, quiet rain. He had turned south into Mitre Street. He had walked the small, short distance along the cobbles. He had reached the wide mouth of the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square. He had turned right. He had taken his small bull's-eye lantern from his belt. He had let its small, careful beam fall across the wet cobbles of the square as he had walked into it. The small beam of his lantern had moved slowly across the small enclosure. It had passed across the long, blank front of the warehouses on the eastern side. It had passed across the small wooden door of Carley and Tonge, behind which George Morris sat at his small wooden desk with his small lamp burning beside him. It had passed across the long empty walls of the small old houses along the southern side. It had reached at last the deep dark of the southwest corner of the square. And there, in the small deep shadow of the corner where no gas lamp had ever burned, the small careful beam of the constable's lantern had fallen upon a small still shape lying close against the long wall of the square. The small careful beam had not moved for a long careful moment. The wet cobbles around the shape had glistened in the soft light of the lantern. The small still shape had not moved at all. The constable had not moved at all. The bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch had rung the slow striking of 1:15 in the morning across the roof-tops of the city. The small light of the lantern had trembled gently in the constable's hand. Constable Watkins had not waited long in the small enclosure. He had crossed the square in the slow, steady tread of his trade. He had reached the small wooden door of the warehouse of Carley and Tonge. He had pushed it open. He had stepped into the small front room of the warehouse where George Morris had sat at his small wooden desk with a small lamp burning beside him. He had called out, in the small, breathless voice of a constable who has come upon something that he has never come upon before in the long, careful years of his trade. The small, careful words that he had spoken to George Morris in that first small, breathless moment had been remembered by the older watchman for the long, quiet interviews he later gave to the reporters from the city papers. They had been the slow, small words of a man whose voice has not yet caught up with what his eye has seen. "For God's sake, mate," Watkins had said, "come to my assistance. Here is another woman cut to pieces." George Morris had risen at once from his small wooden desk. He had picked up his small lamp. He had followed the constable across the small flagstones of the warehouse front room and out into the wet cobbles of the small enclosure. The two of them had walked together across the square to the deep dark of the southwest corner. The small light of the lamp and the small light of the constable's lantern had fallen together upon the small still shape lying close against the long wall. George Morris had looked once. He had taken in the small careful weight of what lay there. He had turned at once. He had begun to run across the square toward the wide mouth of Mitre Street, with his small lamp swinging in one hand and his whistle pulled out of his coat into the other. He had blown the small shrill blast of the watchman's whistle as he had reached the corner. He had run on along Mitre Street toward Aldgate with the whistle blowing as he ran. The whistle had carried sharp and shrill through the soft autumn rain of the small hours. It had reached within a short distance of Aldgate the slow, steady tread of Constable James Harvey upon his beat. Harvey had heard the whistle. He had turned in its direction. He had seen George Morris running toward him along the long line of Mitre Street, with the small lamp swinging in his hand, and the small breathless cries of his voice carrying ahead of him. Constable Harvey had broken into a run himself. He had crossed the small distance between them in a small handful of seconds. He had reached George Morris at the corner of Aldgate. He had been told, in the small breathless words of the older watchman, what had been found in the small enclosure of Mitre Square beyond. Constable Harvey had seen, a short distance along Aldgate, the slow, steady tread of another city constable upon his beat. The man was Constable Holland, holding the long collar number 814. Morris had called him over. The three of them had begun to walk at once, back along the line of Mitre Street, toward the small enclosure of Mitre Square. They had reached it within a short minute. They had walked together across the wet cobbles to the deep dark of the south-west corner. They had looked once. They had stood, in the slow, steady tread of their trade, with the small, steady lights of their lanterns falling upon the small, still shape at their feet. Constable Holland had been sent at once to fetch the city police surgeon, Dr. George William Sequera, whose small surgery stood at 34 Jury Street, a short distance to the north of the square. Dr. Sequera had been roused from his small upstairs bedroom. He had pulled on his long coat and taken up his small black bag and walked the short distance back through the wet streets to the small enclosure of Mitre Square. He had arrived shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. He had stood for a small moment at the deep dark of the south-west corner. He had looked upon the small still shape that lay there. He had given, in the slow, careful voice of his profession, the small dry pronouncement of the doctor. The woman before them was dead. Word had been sent at once to Inspector Edward Collard at the Bishopsgate Police Station, who had set in motion the long, careful chain of the city police investigation. Word had been sent to Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, the senior police surgeon of the city police, at his small house at 17 Finsbury Circus. Word had been sent to the long, quiet offices of the acting commissioner Major Henry Smith, at 26 Old Jury. The long, careful machinery of the City of London police had begun to turn at once around the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square. Constables had begun to converge upon it from every direction. The small front window of the house of Constable Purrs, at No. 3 Mitre Square, had at last grown bright behind its drawn curtain, as the resident constable had been woken by the whistles and the running boots of his colleagues in the square outside his door. But for the small, careful moment before all of that, in the small inner enclosure itself, there had been only the soft, slow rain coming down upon the wet cobbles, and the small, steady lights of the lanterns of the three constables at the deep dark of the south-west corner, and the small lamp of George Morris still burning beside them, and the long, quiet sound of the bells of St. Botolph's striking the slow first hour of the morning above the rooftops of the city. The small inner enclosure of Mitre Square had grown quiet around them in the soft autumn rain. The long blank fronts of the warehouses had stood watching above. The small empty houses along the south-west had stood watching too, and the small still shape at the deep dark of the corner had lain quiet beneath the soft light of the lanterns, with the long old stones of the square holding the small careful weight of what the night had given them, and the small slow rain coming down upon the cobbles, soft and steady, as it had come down upon them through the whole of that long wet September of the year 1888. Chapter 13. The Yard at Berners Street. Berners Street ran south from the long line of Commercial Road, through the long crowded courts of the parish of St. George in the east, in the great metropolitan division of the East End of London, a small distance to the east of the long line of Aldgate. It was a narrow working street of small terraced houses and small warehouses and small backyards, with the long curving river of the Thames running not far away behind the great docks at its southern end. It was not, in any way, a remarkable street. It carried no great market. It held no great churches. Its small terraced houses had been built up through the long Victorian decades in the slow, careful way of the workman's parish, with small front parlours and small backyards and small gaslit windows looking out upon the long, quiet cobbles. Its small back parlours held the small, careful families of the dockmen and the porters and the small Jewish tailors of the parish, who had come from the long quiet villages of Central Europe through the long pogroms of the 1880s. By the small hours of the morning of the 30th of September in the year 1888, the long line of Bermondsey Street had grown quiet. The shop fronts had been closed and shuttered. The small terraced houses had darkened their front windows. The gas lamps along its length had burned down to their small steady flames in the soft autumn rain. The bells of the small parish church of St. Mary at Whitechapel had rung the slow striking of 1 hour past midnight across the wet rooftops. The cobbles had glistened in the soft uneven light of the lamps. A few small figures had moved along the street in the soft late hour. A small constable of the Metropolitan Force had walked his slow steady beat across the southern end. A small handful of the working women of the parish had stood quiet at the corners of the side lanes. But along the small western side of the street, between the small terraced houses numbered 40 and 42, a single building had stood with its windows still lit. The building had been a small workmen's club, called by its members the International Working Men's Educational Club. Its membership had been drawn from the Jewish socialist immigrants of the East End, many of them refugees from the long pogroms of the Russian Empire that had broken out in the early years of the 1880s, who had brought with them across the long flat fields of Central Europe the small revolutionary papers and the long careful debates of their old home countries. They met at the club to read newspapers in Yiddish and in Russian and in German, to print their small revolutionary journals at the small press in the back room, to hear lectures upon the long questions of labour and of capital, and to sing the old songs of the long working classes of Central Europe. On the evening of the 29th September, the club had held a special meeting of its members and their friends, and the long warm light of the club's windows had glowed steadily into the wet cobbles of Bermondsey Street through the long hours of the late evening, and the soft sound of singing had drifted out into the wet night through the small open window of the upstairs hall. To one side of the club, along the small narrow side wall between the building and the small house at number 40 next door, there ran a narrow gateway into the small backyard of the building. The gateway was perhaps 9 feet wide. It had been hung with 2 wooden gates that had been folded back during the hours of business. The small yard beyond it stretched perhaps 20 feet back from the line of the street, between the long wall of the club on one side and the small back wall of the houses of Fairclough Street on the other. The yard had been known to the people of the street by the older name of Dutfield's Yard, after a small wheelwright named Walter Dutfield, who had once kept his small workshop along its southern side. The wheelwright had gone now. His small workshop had been left empty. The yard had stood quiet behind its open gateway through the long evening of Saturday the 29th of September, with the long warm light of the club spilling softly across one corner of its wet cobbles. It was into this small wet yard, in the soft hour before 1 o'clock in the morning of the 30th of September, that a woman of 44 years of age had walked, according to the small witnesses of Bermondsey Street, in the company of a man whose face none of them would ever quite be able to describe. Her name was Elizabeth Stride. She had been born 44 years before in a small farming parish near the western Swedish town of Gothenburg, where she had been baptized by her parents under the long Swedish name of Elisabeth Gustafsdotter. She had come to England as a young woman in the long working migration of the Scandinavian poor through the 1860s and 70s. She had married, in the early years of her time in London, an English carpenter named John Stride, with whom she had run a small coffee shop in Poplar through the long working years that followed. The marriage had broken down by the middle 1880s. The coffee shop had failed. Her husband had died of heart disease in the long autumn of 1884. She had drifted through the small lodging houses of Whitechapel through the long years that followed. She had been known to her friends along Flower and Dean Street and Dorset Street by the small affectionate nickname of Long Liz, for her tall thin figure and her long careful manner. She had been seen several times in the late hours of the evening of the 29th of September by several of the small witnesses of Bermondsey Street. A workman named William Marshall had seen her at about 11:45 in conversation with a man outside the door of his lodgings at number 64 Bermondsey Street. A police constable named William Smith had passed her at about 12:30 in conversation with another man at the same end of the street. A workman named James Brown had seen her at about 1:45 in further conversation with a man near the small board school at the southern end of the street, and a man called Israel Schwartz, walking south along the western pavement of the street at about 1:45, had seen her in some kind of small struggle with a man at the open gateway of Dutfield's Yard itself. It was at about 1 o'clock in the morning of the 30th of September that a small pony cart had turned slowly from the long line of Commercial Road into the narrow line of Berner Street. The cart had been driven by a man called Louis Diemschutz. He was a Russian Jew of 26 years of age. He worked as a salesman of small cheap jewellery in the long open markets of the southern suburbs of London. He had returned that night from a long day's trade at the small market on Westow Hill in Crystal Palace, with his small cart of unsold goods rattling behind his weary pony. He had been the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club at number 40 Berner Street, where he and his wife had kept their small upstairs lodging. He had driven his small cart slowly along the wet cobbles of the street in the soft late hour, with the small lights of the club's upstairs windows glowing softly above him. He had turned his small cart toward the open gateway of Dutfield's yard, the better to put his pony to rest in the small backyard of the club for the night. The pony, however, had shied to the left as it had approached the dark mouth of the gateway. The small animal had refused to move forward. The salesman had clicked his tongue at the pony. He had touched it gently with his whip. The pony had not moved. The salesman had looked down into the small dark space to the right of the cart where the pony's eye had turned, and he had seen, in the soft uneven light spilling out from the upstairs windows of the club above, a small dark shape lying close against the long inner wall of the gateway. Perhaps a foot or two inside the long inner wall of the gateway. Perhaps a foot or two inside the line of the yard. Louis Diemschutz had jumped down from the small front of his cart. He had taken a small wax match from the pocket of his coat. He had struck it against the wet stone of the gateway. He had held the small flame down toward the small dark shape on the wet cobbles. The small flame had burned for a moment in the soft autumn rain. The small light of it had fallen upon the small still shape at his feet, and in the soft dim moment before the small flame had been blown out by the wind from the river, Louis Diemschutz had seen, with the small careful clarity of a working man who has come upon something he did not expect, the small still body of a small thin woman lying upon the wet cobbles of the gateway, with her thin clothing pulled closely about her shoulders. He had turned at once. He had walked into the small front passage of the club. He had called up the small back staircase to his wife, who had been sitting in their small upstairs lodging with the small lamp burning beside her. He had told her, in his slow, soft Russian, what he had seen in the small, wet gateway of the yard. He had then crossed the small front passage of the club into the small meeting room beyond, where a small handful of the members had still been sitting at their small wooden tables, and where the small evening singing had not yet quite faded from the warm air. He had told them in his slow, soft Yiddish what he had seen. The members of the club had risen at once from their small wooden tables. They had taken up small candles and small lamps. They had walked out together through the small front passage of the building, and had gathered around the small dark shape in the gateway of Dutfield's yard. They had stood, in the soft uneven light of their candles and their lamps, looking down upon the small still figure at their feet. One of the younger members, a man called Isaac Kozbrowski, had been sent at once to run for the police. A Metropolitan Police Constable named Henry Lamb had been walking his beat at the corner of Commercial Road and Berner Street at the moment the runners had reached him. He had returned at once with them to the small yard. He had pushed his way through the small handful of club members standing about the gateway. He had looked once at the small still figure in the soft light of his bull's-eye lantern. He had blown the small shrill blast of his whistle into the wet air. He had begun to call for help from the other constables of the Metropolitan Division. Within a small handful of minutes the small narrow yard had been surrounded by Metropolitan officers, and the small wet cobbles of the gateway had been closed off against the small curious crowd of Berner Street. The Metropolitan Police Surgeon, Dr. Frederick William Blackwell, had been roused from his small house at 100 Commercial Road. He had walked the short distance to the small yard. He had bent down beside the small still figure in the soft light of the constables' lanterns. He had pronounced, in the slow, careful voice of his profession, the small dry pronouncement of the doctor. The woman lying in the gateway was dead. The single deep cut across her throat had been the only mark upon her. The rest of her small thin body had been left untouched. The blood beneath her had still been warm when the salesman had first found her. The doctors of the Metropolitan Force had remarked at once upon the curious quiet of what they had found. The woman called Elizabeth Stride had been killed but a small few minutes before her discovery. The killer had cut once, and once only, and had not stayed. He had been perhaps interrupted in the small turning of his work, interrupted by the slow rattle of the pony cart turning into the gateway, interrupted by the long warm light of the workers' club spilling softly across the wet cobbles of the yard, interrupted by the small careful presence of the lodgers and the singers, and the small steady members of the International Working Men's Educational Club. He had not stayed to finish what the long dark hours of the night had drawn him out to do. By the slow turning of the small dawn upon the eastern parishes, the long brick courts of the East End had begun to fill with the small breathless news of what had happened in the night. The news had carried from Bermondsey Street to Whitechapel Road. It had carried from Whitechapel Road to Hanbury Street and to Brick Lane and to Commercial Street. It had reached the small back kitchens of Flower and Dean Street and the small front parlours of Spitalfields and the small dark courts of Dorset Street. And by the slow turning of the late morning, when the church bells of the parishes had begun to ring the slow Sunday hour out across the rooftops, the news had reached far beyond the East End itself, and had carried out across the long quiet streets of the great metropolis to every corner of the kingdom beyond. The small yard of Dutfields lay quiet by then beneath the soft autumn rain. The members of the International Working Men's Educational Club had been removed from the building for questioning by the Metropolitan Police. The lights in the upstairs windows of the club had been put out. The small lamps along Bermondsey Street had burned soft and steady through the long Sunday morning. The bells of St. Mary at Whitechapel had rung the slow striking of every quarter, and the long thin shadow of what had happened in the small wet yard had drifted softly across the quiet rooftops of the East End, with a soft autumn rain falling steadily upon the slates above, and the bells of the city churches ringing their slow Sunday hour across the long quiet morning of the eastern parishes. Chapter 14. The Apron in Goulston Street. Goulston Street ran north from Whitechapel High Street to the long crowded heart of the parish of Whitechapel, in the metropolitan division of the East End of London. It was a narrow working street, lined for most of its length with the small shop fronts and the small terraced houses of the Jewish immigrant trade, the small tailoring shops, the small kosher butchers, the small bakers turning out their long Sabbath loaves before the dawn of each Saturday morning. It carried, through every hour of every working week, the slow careful tide of the Jewish community of the Eastern Parish, who had come to those small streets from the long pogroms of Central Europe through the long decade of the 1880s. Its small cobbles glistened in the soft, uneven light of the gas lamps along its length. Its small flankstone passages between the buildings opened, at intervals along the western side, into the great Sunday market of Petticoat Lane, which ran along the parallel line of Wentworth Street, and would open in a few short hours upon the long Sunday morning of the 30th of September in the year 1888. Along the eastern side of the street, between the small shop fronts and the small terraced houses, stood a long row of newer brick tenements that had been built in the previous 20 years by the Improved Industrial Dwellings Company for the better housing of the working poor. They had been raised by the slow, patient hand of the social reform movement of the long Victorian middle decades, who had grown convinced that the slums of the East End could be replaced, one block at a time, with the brick model dwellings of a better organised future. The largest of these tenements along Goulston Street had been built in the early 70s and had been called by their company name the Wentworth Model Dwellings, after a small old lane behind the building. They had risen 6 stories high above the cobbles. They had housed several dozen working families behind their long brick fronts, most of them small Jewish tailoring families from the long valleys of Russia and Poland. They had been entered through a series of small open passageways, where a person off the street could walk straight into the inner stairwell of the block, with the iron staircase running up its centre, and the dark black brick of the jambs of the passageway pressing close upon either side. Through the long hours of the night of the 29th into the 30th of September in the year 1888, a Metropolitan Police Constable named Alfred Long had walked his slow careful beat along the line of Goulston Street. He held the long collar number 254H, of the H Division of the Metropolitan Police, the division that took in the parishes of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. He had come on duty earlier in the evening, and he had walked his small route through the long line of Goulston Street and the surrounding small streets through the long quiet hours. He had passed through the entrance passageway of the Wentworth Model Dwellings, at the flats numbered 108 through 119, at about 20 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning. He had walked through the small flagstone space slowly. He had looked into the dark stairwell with his small bull's-eye lantern. He had seen nothing. He had carried on along his beat into the small turning of the next half hour. At about 5 minutes before 3 o'clock in the morning, Constable Long had come back around the long, careful turn of his slow beat. He had walked once more into the entrance passageway of the Wentworth model dwellings with his small bullseye lantern at his belt and the soft autumn rain still falling steadily upon the cobbles of Goulston Street outside. And there, in the small flagstone space at the foot of the iron staircase, in the very place that he had passed 35 minutes earlier without seeing anything at all, he had found two small things that had not been there before. He had found two small things that had not been there before. The first was a small piece of blood-stained cloth lying on the flagstones at the foot of the staircase. It was a piece of an apron, torn roughly along one edge. It was perhaps the size of a folded handkerchief. It was wet with blood along one of its corners. It had been left there in the small space at the foot of the stairs, in the way of a small thing dropped quietly by a person passing in the dark. The second was a line of white chalk writing upon the wall above the cloth. The writing had been made in the small white chalk that the children of the parish used upon the cobbles for their hopscotch games. It had been written upon the long black brick jamb of the entrance passageway at about the height of a man's chest, in a slow, careful hand. The letters had been even. The lines had been straight. The whole inscription had been but a single short sentence in 5 neat lines. The constable copied it carefully into his small notebook by the soft light of his lantern. It read, in the small, careful 5 lines of the slow, steady chalk, "The Jewers are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Constable Long had read the small line twice. He had marked it down in his notebook. He had looked back at the small piece of blood-stained cloth at his feet. He had not, at that moment, known of the killing in Mitre Square less than a quarter of a mile away. He had thought, in the slow, careful way of his trade, that someone might have been attacked in one of the small flats of the building above him. He had called over the constable of the next beat, holding the long collar number 190H, and the two of them had walked together up the small iron staircase from one landing to the next, looking for any further sign of blood. They had found none. They had come down again. Constable Long had left the second constable to guard the small space at the foot of the stairs. He had walked away from the Wentworth model dwellings at a hurried pace toward the long brick front of the Commercial Street Police Station, where his inspector on duty would be informed. While Constable Long was at the Commercial Street Station, the news of the killing in Mitre Square had begun to make its way out across the eastern parishes. The inspector on duty at the Commercial Street Station, hearing of the blood-stained cloth and the small chalked line at the same hour, had understood at once that the two findings were one and the same matter. He had set out at once for the Wentworth model dwellings with Constable Long beside him. The piece of cloth had been handed over from the constables to Inspector MacWilliam of the City Police, who had matched it later that morning at the Golden Lane mortuary to the small jagged tear along the apron worn by the woman in Mitre Square. It had been a piece of her apron. It had been carried by some hand, dropped or white, from the small enclosure where her life had ended to the small open passageway of the model dwellings half a mile away. By a little before 4 o'clock in the morning, a small handful of officers from both the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police had gathered in the small open passageway at the foot of the Wentworth model dwellings. The Metropolitan men were there because the model dwellings stood within their jurisdiction. The City men were there because the killing in Mitre Square had been theirs. Detective Constable Daniel Hulls of the City Police had been one of those who had come from the small enclosure of the square to the small open passageway of the dwellings. He had stood in the small lamplight beside the chalked writing. He had read it twice. He had written it carefully into his own notebook, with a small slight variation of his own. The careful words of the city officer and the careful words of the Metropolitan Constable would never quite agree afterwards, in the long, careful records of the inquest. But the small general sense of the inscription had been the same in both careful notebooks. The two forces, gathered in the small passageway in the soft cold of the early morning, had begun to disagree at once over what should be done with the small chalked writing on the wall above the cloth. The City Police, represented by Detective Constable Hulls and by Inspector MacWilliam, had wanted to leave it where it stood. They had wanted to send for a photographer at the dawning of the day, so that the writing could be photographed and kept as a small piece of evidence in the long, careful investigation. They had argued that the small chalked line, whatever it meant, might prove to be the only mark the killer had left behind him upon the walls of the East End. The Metropolitan Police, represented by Superintendent Thomas Arnold and by the constables of H Division, had wanted to wash the writing off the wall before the dawn. They had been afraid of what the day would bring. The great market at Petticoat Lane, The long Sunday market of the East End that ran along Wentworth Street and Middlesex Street would open within a few short hours. The crowds of Sunday morning would come pressing through Goulston Street and around the Wentworth model dwellings on their way to the market. The small chalk line in the rough English of a hand that had spelled the word for the Jewish people of the parish in the unusual way of Jewsers might be read in the long ugly habit of blaming the foreigner that had always lain just beneath the surface of the East End, as a small invitation to riot. By a little after 4 o'clock in the morning, Sir Charles Warren himself, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the tall thin man with the long grey moustache and the long parade ground bearing of the Royal Engineers, had been roused from his bed at his small house in Westminster, and had been brought by hansom cab through the long quiet streets of the city to the small entrance passway of the Wentworth dwellings. He had stood in the small lamplight beside the chalked writing. He had read it for himself. He had listened to the slow, careful arguments of his own superintendents, and to the slow, careful arguments of the city constables. He had stood in the soft autumn rain of the small hours, and he had weighed the small careful balance of the two cases in his mind. He had decided in the end against the photographers. He had decided that the writing must come off the wall. He had given the order, in the slow careful voice of a commissioner who had served his long years in the burning sands of the Empire, that a constable was to take a sponge of clean water and wipe the small white chalk from the long black brick of the entrance passageway before the soft light of the dawn could reach Goulston Street, and before the crowds of Petticoat Lane could reach Goulston Street, and before the crowds of Petticoat Lane could crissing past the small open passageway on their long Sunday morning. The city police had protested. The city police had been overruled. The commissioner had stood his ground. At about 5:15 o'clock in the morning, a constable of H Division had been sent to fetch a small bucket of clean water and a small sponge from the long iron-bound back rooms of the Wentworth model dwellings. He had returned to the small passageway. He had wet the small sponge. He had reached up to the long black brick jamb of the entrance, at the small height of a man's chest, where the small white chalk had stood in its slow, careful 5 lines through the long, small hours of the morning. He had wiped the sponge slowly across the brick. The small white letters had grown faint. The small white letters had grown fainter. The small white letters had been gone. The long black brick jamb of the entrance passageway of the Wentworth model dwellings had stood quiet and dark again, with the soft autumn rain still falling steadily upon the cobbles of Goulston Street outside. The small chalked line had not been photographed. The small chalked line had not been preserved. The small chalked line had been carried away on the wet sponge of an H Division constable and poured out in the small waste of a backyard drain before the soft light of the dawn had touched the rooftops of the East End. 2 versions of the line survived in the small notebooks of 2 careful officers. The version that Police Constable Alfred Long of the Metropolitan Force had copied down in the small soft light of his bullseye lantern, and the slightly different version that Detective Constable Daniel Halls of the City of London Police had copied down later in the same small lamplight. The 2 versions would never quite agree. The small original on the wall would never be seen again. Above the Wentworth model dwellings on Goulston Street, the soft light of the dawn began to climb the long brick fronts of the building, as the constables and the inspectors at last drifted away into the long careful work of the early Sunday morning. The small open passageway at the foot of the iron staircase stood quiet again behind them. The small flagstone where the piece of blood-stained cloth had lain stood quiet. The long black brick jamb above it stood quiet. The small first lights of the Petticoat Lane market began to glow at the eastern end of Wentworth Street. The first slow voices of the small Jewish stall-holders began to call to one another along the wet cobbles in the soft slow Yiddish of the parish. The bells of Christ Church, Spitalfields, rang the slow striking of 5:30 in the morning across the long crowded rooftops of the East End, and the long quiet of the small hours at last gave way, very gently, to the long slow waking of the Sunday morning of the 30th of September in the year 1888. Active. Chapter 15. The stones of Mitre Square. The City of London mortuary stood at the corner of Golden Lane and Honduras Street, a small brick building behind a small iron gate in the small parish of St. Luke's just north of the long brick face of the Barbican. It had been built in the long careful way of the city institutions, for the slow holding of the dead of the parish before their burial. Its small front room held a long wooden bench and a small iron stove. Its small back room held 2 long stone slabs upon which the dead were laid out by the slow careful hands of the city mortuary keepers. It was here that the body of the small woman, who had been found in the small enclosure of Mitre Square, had been taken in the soft early hours of the 30th of September in the year 1888, in the slow, careful way of the city police. It was here that she had lain for the long days that followed, awaiting the slow turning of the inquest at the small coroner's court next door. 4 days later, on the morning of Thursday the 4th of October, the long, careful inquest into her death had been opened before the coroner of the City of London, a man named Samuel Frederick Langham. He had been the city coroner for some good many years by then. He had been a careful and a long-serving man, with the slow, grave manner of a coroner who had presided over the slow turning of 100 small inquests across the parishes of the city. He had opened the proceedings in the small coroner's court of the coroner's office in Golden Lane, with the jurors seated upon the long wooden benches of the courtroom, with the small handful of reporters from the city papers crowded into the back of the room, and with the careful witnesses called in turn to the long polished bar of the court. The first witness called before the coroner that morning had been the man called John Kelly, the small gentle market porter who had shared his small upstairs lodging at Cooney's lodging house with the deceased through the last 7 years of her life. He had come to the Bishopsgate Police Station on the Tuesday following the killing, after he had read in the newspapers of the small mustard tin and the small pawn ticket of Emily Burrell that had been found beside the body in Mitre Square. He had gone from the police station to the Golden Lane mortuary. He had stood beside the long stone slab. He had looked once. He had nodded once. He had given the small, thin name of his common-law wife to the city constables, in the slow, soft voice of a man who had carried something heavy in his arms. At the inquest, John Kelly had given his evidence in the slow, careful voice of a working man who had been brought into a place where he did not belong. He had said that the woman he had identified had been the woman called Catherine Eddowes, sometimes known as Kate Conway, sometimes known as Kate Kelly. He had said that he had known her for 7 years past. He had said that she had been a steady and a respectable woman by the standards of the lodging houses. He had said that she had been on her way that Saturday afternoon to find her grown daughter Annie in Bermondsey, with the small hope of borrowing a small loan to carry them both through the slow turning of the next week. He had said that he had last seen her at about 2 o'clock that afternoon at the corner of Houndsditch, and that she had told him she would be home no later than 4. He had said little else. He had taken his place quietly upon the long wooden bench of the witnesses. Other witnesses had been called in their turn through the slow, careful course of the inquest. Joseph Loende had come to the bar of the court. Joseph Hyam Levy had come to the bar of the court. Harry Harris had come to the bar of the court. Police Constable Edward Watkins had come to the bar of the court. George Morris had come to the bar of the court. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown and Dr. George William Sequeira had come to the bar of the court, and they had given their slow, careful medical evidence in the small, careful language of their profession. Frederick William Wilkinson, the deputy of Cooney's lodging house, had come to the bar of the court. Police Constable George Henry Hutt, the gaoler of the Bishopsgate cells, had come to the bar of the court. The city solicitor and the inspectors of the city detective branch had asked their slow, careful questions in their turn through the long, quiet morning. The inquest had adjourned at the close of its first day. It had reopened at the close of the following week, on Thursday the 11th of October. The coroner had given his slow, careful summing up to the jury. The jury had withdrawn to consider their verdict. They had returned within a short half-hour. They had returned the verdict that the coroner had asked them to consider: wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. The verdict had been entered into the long official records of the Corporation of the City of London, and before the jurors had left the court, each one of the 12 of them had agreed quietly with the coroner to give the small jury fees they had earned for their service to the grown daughter of the deceased, the young Annie Phillips of Bermondsey, who was the only one of the small Eddowes children to have been traced by the city police. 3 days before the closing of the inquest, on Monday the 8th of October in the year 1888, the body of Catherine Eddowes had been carried out from the Golden Lane mortuary for the long, quiet ride to her grave. The cost of the funeral had been paid in full by a small private citizen, an undertaker named Charles Hawkes of Banner Street in the parish of St. Luke's, who had offered to defray the entire expense out of his own pocket, on the grounds that the deceased had been a working woman of the parish whose family had not the means to bury her properly. The undertaker had provided a small polished elm coffin, with oak mouldings along its sides, and with a small plate of gilt letters along its top that read, "Catherine Eddowes. Died Septode, 30, 1888, aged 43 years. The age upon the plate had been a small error of the undertaker's hand. She had been 46 years old. The small mistake had not been corrected. The funeral procession had left the Golden Lane mortuary at about 1:30 in the afternoon. The crowds of the East End had gathered in the streets around Golden Lane and Aldgate to watch the small, slow passing of the cortege. The Daily Telegraph had reported the next morning that the windows and the rooftops of the adjoining buildings had been occupied by groups of spectators. The procession had consisted of a small open-glass hearse, drawn by 2 black horses with great black plumes upon their foreheads, with the polished elm coffin laid out in its centre. Behind the hearse had followed a single mourning coach, in which had ridden the grown daughter Annie Phillips with her young husband, the 2 surviving sisters of the deceased called Elizabeth Fisher and Eliza Gold, and the small, careful, gentle figure of John Kelly. Behind the mourning coach had followed a small brougham containing the representatives of the city press. The procession had moved slowly through the long streets of the East End. A force of city police under Superintendent Foster had walked beside it as far as the boundary of the city. At Old Street a large number of Metropolitan Police under Inspector Barnum had taken over the small, careful escort. The procession had passed Whitechapel Parish Church. It had moved along the long line of Mile End Road through the small, dense crowds of the East End. It had passed through Bow and Stratford. It had turned at last out of the long streets of London into the long Ilford Main Road, and it had reached the small iron gates of the City of London Cemetery shortly before 3:30 in the afternoon. The City of London Cemetery had been opened in the year 1856 in the small parish of Little Ilford, in the long flat marsh country of southern Essex, a few miles to the east of the great smoky city. It was the burial ground of the Corporation of the City of London, who had built it upon 200 acres of open ground to receive the slow-turning generations of the city's dead at a time when the small parish churchyards of the city itself had long since been overfilled. It had been a vast and a careful place, with long avenues of lime trees and small Gothic chapels, and the slow-turning seasons of an English country graveyard, laid out by the slow, careful hand of William Haywood, the city surveyor, in the long Gothic taste of the 1850s. The Reverend T. Dunscombe, the cemetery chaplain, had received the small cortege at the small Gothic gates of the cemetery. It conducted the burial service in the small chapel and at the graveside. He had made, by the careful agreement of the small mourning party, no reference to the murder at all. The small polished elm coffin had been carried slowly along one of the long lime-tree avenues to the unmarked public grave that had been opened for it in the long square section of the cemetery that the burial registers numbered as Square 30T Sims, numbered as Square 3018, plot number 49336. The grave had held, in the way of the public graves of the cemetery, a small number of other coffins below the one that had been laid down that afternoon. The small, slow words of the burial service had been spoken. The small handful of mourners had stood quietly beside the grave. The small, heavy clods of the southern Essex clay had been let down upon the polished elm of the coffin. The Reverend T. Dunscombe had spoken his small, careful, final blessing. The undertaker, Charles Hawkes, had folded his small handkerchief into his coat. John Kelly had walked slowly back to the carriage, with his hat held quietly in his hand. The grown daughter Annie Phillips had cried softly in the soft autumn light. The long, quiet years that followed had carried away most of the small places of her life. The small terraced house at Merridale Street in Wolverhampton, where she had been born in the spring of 1842, had stood through the long Victorian and Edwardian decades and into the long 20th century, though the long industrial town around it had grown and changed about it many times over. The small charity school at St. John's on Tooley Street had been closed and rebuilt in the long, careful way of the London schools. The small Bermondsey workhouse on Tanner Street had been demolished and replaced. The old hall works in Wolverhampton had gone the way of the tinplate trade. The small fairs of the country towns had given way to other small entertainments. The small printing presses of Sam Selman in Church Street, Bilston, had stopped their slow, steady running. The small gallows of the county gallows at Stafford had been pulled down. The long, crowded courts of the East End of London, where she had lived the last 7 years of her life with John Kelly at Cooney's lodging house, had been swept away through the long, slow years of the social reform movement of the 1890s. Flower and Dean Street had been demolished in the year 1891, with the long row of common lodging houses pulled down to make way for the model dwellings of Nathaniel Dwellings, which had opened upon the cleared ground in the year 1892. The small back kitchen at number 55 Flower and Dean Street, where she had drunk her tea from a tin cup with John Kelly in the long autumn evenings of their 7 years together, had gone with the long row. The cobbles had been relaid. The small streets had been renamed. Whitechapel and Spitalfields had grown into the long quiet brick parishes of the 20th century, and the small inner enclosure of Mitre Square had gone on changing too. The long warehouses of Keighley and Tongue had stood along its eastern side until the long century closed, and then they had been pulled down and replaced by a series of office blocks in the slow, careful way of the city's renewal. The small empty houses along the southwest corner had been demolished. The small wooden door of the night watchman's room had been carried away in the rubble of the long warehouses. The three narrow passages, Mitre Street and St. James Passage and Church Passage, had been kept in their old lines. The Church Passage had been renamed in the long careful records of the parish as St. James Passage, and the older name had quietly slipped from the maps. A small flower bed had been placed in the year 1986 upon the very ground of the southwest corner, where the small still shape had once lain. The flower bed had been a small unintentional memorial of the kind that the working trade of the city had not, at the time, quite known how to mark. The small office buildings around it had been knocked down and rebuilt again through the long turning decades. By the year 2017, a great new office building called One Cree Church Place had been raised along the northern side of the square, with its long glass walls rising 19 stories above the rooftops of the eastern city. The small open enclosure at its centre had been kept, by the careful insistence of the City Corporation, as a small pedestrian space where the small history of the place could still be felt by those who came to look for it. In more recent years, a small memorial plaque has been placed near the southwest corner of Mitre Square, in the quiet way of the small memorials of the East End, where the small thin shape had once lain in the soft autumn rain of another century. The plaque carries in the small careful lettering of the city stonecutters the name of the woman whose life ended there, and the date upon which it ended, and a small soft phrase of remembrance. It is not large. It is not loud. It is a small careful note set into the long brick walls of the renewed enclosure, where the few visitors who come to Mitre Square in the long quiet afternoons of the working week may pause for a moment to read it before walking on. The City of London Cemetery at Manor Park still stands today upon its 200 acres of careful Victorian ground. The long avenues of lime trees still line its slow path. The small Gothic chapels still keep their quiet vigil over the slow-turning graves. The grave that received the small polished elm coffin in the soft autumn light of the 8th of October in 1888 has long since been reused in the slow, careful way of the public graves of the cemetery. But a small memorial plaque has been set among the lime trees nearby, in the quiet way of the small reckonings of the long 20th century, to mark the place where she came at last to rest. Catherine Eddowes was born on the 14th of April in the year 1842, in a small terraced house at Graiseley Green in Wolverhampton, the sixth child of George Eddowes, the tinplate worker, and Catherine Evans, the cook, at the Peacock Hotel. She was a quick, clever child, with dark wavy auburn hair and hazel eyes, of small stature and slim build. She walked to London as a small girl in the long walking journey of her family. She was schooled at St. John's Charity School in Bermondsey, and she lost her mother to consumption at the age of 13, and her father not long after. She returned to Wolverhampton, and she worked at the Old Hall Works as a tinplate stamper, and she walked out at the age of 19 with a tall, thin ex-soldier called Thomas Conway, with whom she had 3 children, Annie and Thomas and George. She lived with John Kelly for the last 7 years of her life at Cooney's common lodging house at 55 Flower and Dean Street. She walked down to the hop fields of Kent in every September. She sang the old songs of the country fairs in the worn kitchens of the East End in the long evenings of her later years. She was, in the slow, careful words of those who knew her best, a jolly woman and a clever one, with a sharp small tongue and a quick warm laugh and a long quiet kindness to those who were poorer than herself. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. She was 46 years of age when she died. She has been remembered now for 138 long years upon the small slate roofs of the City of London, and in the small enclosure of Mitre Square, where the long brick walls of the new office buildings stand quiet around the small open space at the centre, and the bells of St. Botolph's at the corner of Houndsditch still ring the slow striking of every quarter out across the rooftops of the eastern city. Her name is still spoken, very softly, by those who come to remember her, A short distance to the east, in the small narrow line of Bermondsey Street, which has since been renamed Hunrick Street in the long quiet way of the 20th century, the small yard of Dutfields is gone, and the long brick building of the International Working Men's Educational Club is gone, and the small narrow gateway where Louis Diemschutz's pony shied to the left in the soft autumn rain of the same night is gone. But the name of the woman who was found there, Elizabeth Stride, sometimes called Lon Liz by those who knew her, in the lodging houses of Flower and Dean Street, is also remembered there, very softly, by those who come to remember her. She was 44 years of age. She was born in a small farming parish near the western Swedish town of Gothenburg, and she had come to London as a young woman, and she had married a carpenter and run a small coffee shop in Poplar, and she had walked the streets of Whitechapel through the long years of her widowhood. She is buried in the slow-turning ground of East London Cemetery in Plaistow, beneath the long, flat grass of the eastern parish where she had lived her last quiet years. And in their own quiet graves elsewhere in the long, careful soil of the eastern parishes lie the others. Mary Ann Nichols, sometimes called Polly, who was found in the small lane of Bucks Row on the 31st of August. Annie Chapman, sometimes called Dark Annie, who was found in the small backyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the 8th of September. Mary Jane Kelly, sometimes called Marie Jeanette, who was the last of the long, quiet five, who was found in the small back room at 13 Miller's Court on the 9th of November. Each of them had a name. Each of them had a story. Each of them had walked the small streets of the East End in the long autumn of 1888. And each of them had been lost upon those streets to the same long shadow that had moved through the gaslight and the fog of that long, terrible season. The small streets of the East End where they lived and worked have been swept away, in part, by the long, slow tides of the 20th century, though the small old line of Aldgate still runs from the corner of the city out to the long, crowded streets of Whitechapel, and the bells of St. Botolph still ring the slow striking of every quarter, and the small autumn rain still comes down upon the cobbles of Mitre Square, soft and slow and patient. It comes down still upon the small flat plaque in the corner of the square. It comes down still upon the long flat ground of Manor Park. It comes down still upon the small slate roofs and the small chimney pots of the eastern parishes, soft and slow and steady, as it has come down upon them for nearly a century and a half now, and as the long slow night of every late September still keeps its small quiet vigil above the rooftops of the East End of London.